Hello and welcome to So You Think You Can Fanon. Please check the link tree in the description and see all of our beautiful, lovely, salacious links to listen to more. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the official announcement of So You Think You Can Fanon 10th edition, the only edition where we get rid of all the rules and replace it with Fortnite dances. I'm your host, Jake Workshop.
Damn.
Here with
Sergio Ward.
Sergio Ward and Matt Boutte-Gilman. Oh, that works too, I guess.
Well, no, because Matt can just be the Matt that works at the Games Workshop by my university. Shout out to Matt from Games Workshop Rochester.
But you already replaced Matt Ward with Serge Ward.
Well, Matt can just be true. Matt.
Okay.
Sure.
I do have to ask, Jake Workshop, can you still Jelk in 10th edition?
No.
Are any changes being made to the Sean Saxon model?
We actually replaced Jelking with sounding.
Ah.
Any other questions?
Did you enhance the sounding for the Slaneshi units?
Of course. Well, it's not enhanced because we just added it in for the first time ever.
What is it as a mechanic?
Yeah.
Does Michael still get an attack bonus if you mention Pathfinder within 5 meters?
Inches.
Inches.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And it's 6 now.
Speaking of 6 inches, we have the All Guardsman party for you.
I'm not sure how those two things correlate, but alright.
Alright, today's chapter is Tyranid Acquisition Experts. As you remember from the last time, they got a mission to go with the Glup Shido Emperor's size. Not to be confused with the sides of the Emperor. The Emperor's size.
We're a different group of Space Marines.
Yes.
Yes.
Blank Glup Shido chapter to go grab a Tyranid. So who wants to start? Because we're not going in Zencaster order. Or at least not...
I'll start.
Yeah, okay.
And then Jacob, and then you.
Gotcha.
Sure.
Interrogator Greg Sargent stood with his group of experts and contemplated the door. It was larger and fancier than any of the others in the hallway. It was also the only door that had been welded shut. The words Psyker holding cells could just barely be seen under the swaths of prayer seals that covered the door. Sarge shuddered at the memories those words dredged up and silently cursed whoever had decided to leave the damned section in during the ship's refitting. And away from Sarge, Chief Engineer Old Bill and Senior Engineer Jim moved forwards. They ignored the official little yellow plaque, which promised a slow and painful death for anyone who opened the doors, and began cutting. At the back of the group, Senior Engine Seer Hannah and the ship's confessor explained why the door had been sealed to a worried-looking xenologist adept. When the xenologist started backing away and suggesting that he didn't really need to personally inspect the cells, Sarge cut in and assured him that the demon which had haunted the place was very, very thoroughly dead. Once the door was cut open, the confessor led the way inside with a censer in one hand and a flamer filled with holy promethium in the other. Sarge thought the priest seemed disappointed when nothing jumped out and tried to eat his soul. The confessor gave the all clear and the whole group trooped in and started assessing the cells. The main room was circular, filled with several pieces of arcane machinery, and was connected via very thick doors to a dozen child-sized holding cells. 11 of those cells were open and looked exactly the same as when Sarge had last seen them. The 12th did not. Instead of the ominously locked door he'd remembered, it was a jagged crater partially filled with debris from a half-collapsed ceiling. The delicate machinery immediately around the crater had been turned to scrap by door shrapnel, and a few clawed footprints could be seen in the wreckage.
One by one, the technical experts reported their finding to the xenologist adept. Old Bill reported that the warp-present shroud was missing a certain key component and would be barely functional. The xenologist asked if missing meant it might be found somewhere, and Sarge explained that in this case, it meant that the piece was welded to the warp drive. Old Bill recommended leaving that part where it was. Jim followed up that the news that the cell size suppressor had been banned with the news that the cell size suppressor had been badly damaged, but he was reasonably confident that by cannibalizing parts and reducing coverage, it could be gotten back up to 80% power. Jim refused to guess whether that was delta, epsilon, or lower level psi suppression, citing his own lack of an idea how the damn thing worked. The xenologist winced at hearing this. Finally, Hannah reported that all 11 intact stasis units were in working order. The problem was that, unless a specimen was going to be child-sized, there'd be no way to fit in one. Putting it half inside a stasis field would result in a half specimen. Trying to overlap the field would result in a rather large explosion, and there was no mechanics-approved method for clutching multiple status units to a larger one. When the xenologist claimed that there was no way anything would work without a stasis field, Hannah begrudgingly admitted that Tink and his assistant might have some not entirely orthodox way of doing it. Sarge groaned at that, but didn't actually say anything. Everyone went quiet as the adept digested the lackluster reports. In the silence, Sarge noticed a faint sound coming from the debris-clogged cell. A las pistol practically materialized in his hands, and he motioned everyone to accept the well-armed confessor back.
As the two men carefully pushed aside the pieces of wreckage, the sound grew clearer. It was a sort of far-off chattering, screaming sound, mixed with what sounded like the thump of heavy crates being moved around, a familiar nasal voice talking to itself. Everyone in the room groaned. Except for Sarge, who thrust his head as far as he could into the wrecked cell and bellowed, "God damn it, Nubby!" There was an articulate scream and the sound of several objects falling over. When the clattering died away, a plaintive, "Bloody hell, Sarge, what you doing down here?" drifted from somewhere in the rear of the cell. Sarge began ripping pieces of the wreckage apart in an effort to find where the trooper was hiding. As he worked with the enraged non-com, embarked on what was sure to be an epic chewing out. "What am I doing? What am I doing? What are you doing, you little idiot? And why in the Emperor's name are you doing it in the Psyker holding cells?" Nubby's tone grew panicked as he registered Sarge's fusion. "I ain't doing nothing. Ain't you made me promise not to go anywhere near your stupid cells. I'm just minding my own business at the bottom of the lifts." This gave Sarge pause, and in the silence, the faint chattering, screaming he'd been hearing under Nubby's voice finally registered. Sarge groaned and the realization hit him. The confessor, who didn't know Nubby quite well, asked if he was in the Chapel of the Emperor, located in the deck below the lift of the bridge. Nubby's hesitant reply of "sorta" was cut off by Sarge. "Nubby, are you using the containment area inside the chapel, the one we built around the unholy screaming crater the Cogtain left when he died, to store contraband?" "No." "Really, Nubby?" "Well, not the contraband per se, just like odds and ends." "God damn it, Nubby! It's not like anyone was using it."
While Sarge and the confessor both sputtered in a mix of horror and frustration, Jim raised the question of how the conversation was actually happening. Sarge couldn't see anything through the gaps in the debris besides the cell's rear wall. He grudgingly ordered Nubby to search the containment room for any sort of communicator or portal. Nubby followed their voices and reported the glowing crater left by the dead Cogton as the source. He hesitantly asked if glowing metal could be a portal and if he should try poking it with something. Sarge's answer was drowned out by a screeching flood of demonic and binary screaming. The noise rose a crescendo as the far wall of the cell started glowing and a jagged length of metal poked through. The blade flailed around like a snake stuck in a hole and slowly hauled something that looked like a cross between a las gun's barrel and a demonic skull out behind it. Sarge leapt aside as the confessor ran forwards and hosed the back of the cell with sanctified promethium. When the noise finally died down, Nubby's voice returned and asked if anyone had seen where his las gun had gone after the metal ate it. Sarge told him it was probably time to get a new gun from Tink and ordered the trooper to return to his quarters immediately without any of his origin end. As the faint sound of Nubby's metal footsteps and curses faded away, Sarge turned to where the xenologist was trying to hide behind Old Bill.
Right. We'll worry about that later. Back to why we're actually down here. You heard the reports. Do you think we can do it? Matt, do you want to be the other voice?
Okay, just to be clear.
Yes.
We have a Psyker containment area with almost no warp presence shrouding, an indeterminate amount of psi suppression, a stasis field that'll be clutched together from smaller units by that mad Xenos you've got hiding in your quarters.
Uh-huh.
And you're asking me if we can use this area, which is already so tainted that it's manifesting major phenomena, to hold a live Tyranid zoanthrope for a months-long warp voyage?
That's right.
It's quite literally the worst idea I've ever heard!
The All Guardsman Party, Tyranid acquisition experts.
So no shit. There we were, heading out beyond the fringes of Imperial space to capture a Xenopsyker, which we would then have to haul kicking and screaming halfway across the galaxy. There were probably shittier missions out there, but that wasn't much comfort. Saying it could always be worse loses its charm when things actually do keep getting worse. The only thing that kept us from labeling it as a suicide mission was the fact that a force from the Emperor's Scythe Space Marines chapter would be leading the actual capture effort. In fact, it was technically their mission. We were just supposed to assist them in the capture, then handle the transport. The fact that we'd be working with and fighting alongside a team of Space Marines didn't actually make us any happier, though. I mean, sure, the Marines are the greatest warriors in all the Imperium, near immortal demigods of war and all that, but we'd been in our share of battles. Every one of us had seen inevitably what happens when the Astartes get called in. Quickest way for a guardsman to meet the Emperor is to be anywhere near a 10-kilometer radius of one of his angels. Sadly, the assignment had come directly from Inquisitor Oak, so there's nothing we could do to avoid it. No matter how insane the mission, no matter how bad our equipment, and how certain our deaths, there was nothing short of desertion that would get us out of our orders. So we went to work, preparing our equipment, and took solace in the most sacred right of all soldiers: complaining.
To start with, Tink complained about how unfair it was to stick him and Theo, our semi-captive Tau scientist, with so much to do in so little time. The two of them worked furiously on the problem of combining the smaller stasis units into a larger one while simultaneously trying to cram more pulse weapons into lasgun disguises and build Spot 2.0. Their efforts were seriously hampered by the fact that Tau science isn't anywhere near as advanced when it comes to stasis fields, or anything related to psychers for that matter, as it is on the subject of plasma on drones. Then, on top of that, there was the whole heretical xenotech on an Imperial vessel issue that we kept skirting around. The xenotech problem wasn't as serious as it used to be, though. Replacing all of our annoying old cogboys with slightly less annoying young cogboys had resulted in far more liberal outlook on the ship's tech priesthood. Sarge still insisted on a more moderate amount of discretion, though, which caused significant slowdowns, especially when combined with Jim's newfound stodginess as head cogboy. Mr. I'm a big boy now head engine seared Jim flat out insisted that none of the junior tech priests were allowed to even work in the same room as Theo, much less lend a mechadendrite. We sort of understood that it was all for the safety of the acolytes, who might get in very deep trouble if they displayed bad habits in their future postings, but it slowed things down considerably. Tink wound up drafting Sarge and most of the adepts as assistants. None of them were very helpful, mind you, but the fact that they were suffering with him cheered Tink up immensely.
Jim, Hannah, and old Bill did their fair share of complaining too. The projects they were working on weren't much easier than Tink's, and they were also trying to keep the ship running and train their new recruits. In the long run, the fresh batch of cogboys was probably going to work out wonderfully. I keep losing my spot. What is happening to me? They put goo in my eyes, and now my eyes don't work. But in the short term, it was complete mayhem. Hannah had it especially bad. She was the one in charge of the newbies, while the others ran their projects. She was driven to the edge of hysterics by a constant barrage of questions and problems, ranging from trivial ones to potentially fatal from the acolytes. The poor cog girl had hid from them in our barracks more than once. While the technical folks whined about overwork, Doc Fumbles and the Xenologist Adept complained to anyone who would listen to them about being used as human guinea pigs. Really, all of them understood that there were no other options for testers, and the containment field had to be tested. They all hated the fact that said testing consisted of the Xenologist coaxing Fumbles into trying to manifest the sort of powers a Zoanthrope might use. While Doc stood around and waited to fix whatever went wrong. And when you combine Fumble trying to use powers outside his comfort zone, a high-stress environment, and the quality of the containment area, you better believe things went wrong. At least Doc did get a lot of practice fixing up injured cogboys, so there was some silver lining.
The only members of the team who weren't involved in the preparing of the containment area were Nubby, Twitch, and Amy. Of course, they didn't let that stand in the way of bitterly complaining. In fact, they used their free time to complain harder. The three of them wandered around the ship on their patrol of the tainted areas, looking for warp phenomena and daemon incursions, while whining to each other about their sorry lot. Nubby had a whole slew of grievances, mostly with Sarge. The chewing out he received for appropriating the Screamy Crater room as a warehouse was minor compared to the one he'd got when he went back in there. Originally, he'd only intended to clear out his stash, but then Tink and Theo had requested he run a few experiments. For science, they'd said. Nubby felt it was entirely unfair that he'd received all the blame for the incident with the crater and the rat. Anyway, the mutated rodent actually hadn't hurt anyone. It had just tasted tech acolyte around for a while and then spontaneously combusted. So Nubby grumbled continuously about how unreasonable Sarge had gotten since his promotion, and the fact that he wasn't even allowed to hang out with Fumbles during tests on account of being disruptive to the work environment.
Twitch had been driven to a significantly higher than usual level of paranoia by the news that he'd be sharing with the ship with a Tyranid. This was compounded by the ban on indiscriminate booby traps that Sarge had enacted after several of the acolytes had gotten themselves injured. The cherry on top, and primary focus of Twitch's complaints, was the fact that Doc had refused to move back into the barracks after his legs had finished healing. Doc claimed his preference for sharing quarters with his hospitaller girlfriend wasn't a slander on the quality of Twitch's defenses, but the demolitions trooper didn't buy it. He interpreted this decision in the same way he did most things, as a complex conspiracy to make him unhappy. Finally, bringing up the rear of the little parade of misanthropy was Amy, who had perhaps the pettiest gripe of all of us. Her hair was messed up. Doc's girlfriend had done a wonderful job of repairing the second set of facial burns our Mark's woman had received, and she'd used some special hospitaller trick to repair Amy's scalp, too. Unfortunately, Amy was completely fixated in the fact that the treatment had left a hand-wide stripe of pure white running through her now buzz-cut hair. None of us really knew why she cared so damn much. Amy hadn't been particularly vain in the past. It was odd that this specific thing loomed so large. Perhaps it was because Nubby had the poor face to say it made her look like a skunk. The three troopers shared the displeasure with just about everything they ran into, whether it was a minor warp beastie, mutant, crutoid, or newbie tech priest. Amy particularly took grim delight in asking every acolyte she saw if they thought her hair looked funny, then doing very mean things to anyone who gave the wrong answer. There wasn't a right one. By the time we were nearing our rendezvous, their antics, as well as the rest of the team's general attitude, had reached such a level that the captain actually took personal notice.
It took a bit of work for Sarge to placate the captain, even though the man was ex-Navy and should have automatically understood the situation. Sarge didn't have any trouble getting across that most of our squad had an entirely, or especially strong dislike for fighting Tyranids, and Psychers for that matter. The problem was that morale is a far different thing on a ship than in a trench, so the captain didn't see why that excused our behavior. Sarge eventually managed to explain that while veteran guardsmen can handle just about anything on the battlefield, they have relatively few coping mechanisms for dealing with slowly impending doom. He asked if the captain would prefer to have a staggering around blind drunk or taking on a more proactive approach to staying alive. The captain agreed that a bit of complaining and misbehavior was better than Twitch manufacturing a reason for why we couldn't complete the mission. In the end, Sarge promised that we'd be ready for action when the time came, and all quietly hoped like hell that he was telling the truth. Luckily, it turned out that he was. On the final day of our warp travel, everything started coming together. The first break was when Tink and Fios successfully managed to put the largest servitor on the ship into stasis. Actually, it was originally the second largest servitor, but the overlapping field had gotten out of sync on the previous test and messily rearranged that hierarchy. Anyways, the test was such a resounding success that they hauled the whole thing down to the cells and crammed Fumbles into it before anyone could stop them. Aside from how long it took them to get to safety, or get our psyker back out of there, aside from how long it took them to safely get our psyker back out of there, the live test went perfectly. Fumble's aura completely vanished when the field was activated, and everyone in the cells cheered. Even Jim seemed happy, despite the way he was chivying his acolytes out of the room, explaining that they were definitely not seeing a Tau or a techno-heretical stasis device.
The news that we'd be transporting a stasis-id Tyranid Psyker, as opposed to the one that was actively trying to kill us, perked everyone up. All of us set aside our little distracting grievances as our warp voyage ended. Well, except for Amy. And Twitch, that is. The Demolition Trooper's behavior wasn't surprising, but the fact that Amy had to be restrained from beating Nubby to death with the bottle of hair dye that he acquired for her was worrying. Fortunately, neither of their obsessions prevented them from prepping for battle, and everyone was ready to kick some ass when we finally reached our destination. When I say we were ready for action, I meant it. We were literally standing in the shuttle bay when the occurrence border came out of warp. The Space Marines weren't going to catch us sitting around and asking for 5 more minutes before the mission. No siree. So it was sort of awkward when there wasn't anyone at the rendezvous. We stood in the bay for an hour before we gave up in disgust, while the rest of us wandered off muttering blasphemous remarks about the Emperor's Angels of Death and their idea of punctuality. As we did so, Sarge headed up to the bridge to see what the hell was going on. We'd really expected to find the Marines there ahead of us. It's not like we had a very fast ship. We'd even entertained the faint hope they'd already had the zoanthrope tied up and ready for us. Either way, it would be a matter of in and out before the NIDS even realized we were there. At least that's what we hoped. It was a rather unsettling to find ourselves sitting absolutely alone at the far edge of a hostile system. It didn't even stay unsettling for long, though. When we took a look around and saw just how hostile the system was, we bumped the situation up to outright terrifying.
Now, we'd all read Oak's orders. It was obvious that the system would be a battleground. Not even Marines are suicide enough to try this sort of thing in a wholly Tyranid-controlled system. None of us had been optimistic enough to bet on finding a system that was being cleansed by a massive Imperial fleet, but we'd hoped that our destination would be, well, some Imperial frontier world that just wasn't on our maps. Preferably one that had just been reinforced by a few regiments of Guard and was fighting off a very small splinter fleet. Of course, if we couldn't get a world with more Guardsmen than NIDS, we'd have more than happily settled for any Imperial presence, regardless of how many bugs there were. Hell, we would have been happy with one of those weird independent systems you got out here, or even a Tau world, as long as they were busy with the fucking NIDS. All we really wanted was a system where the fight was sort of even, and one side wouldn't be shooting at us. Instead, what we saw when the occurrence border scanners came online was 4 planets, 4 hive ships, and thousands, if not millions, of far smaller ships. Closer inspection revealed that the little vessels were inorganic, that they were attacking the hive ships with mixed success. Sarge left the bridge shortly after the first detailed scans came in. Sarge came down and gave us the bad news. It was something we needed to know after all, but he took the precaution of stopping at the med bay on the way down. Even with the heavy trank and the Hospitaler's help, Twitch nearly managed to escape into the ship's pipework before Sarge finished telling us about the little ships. They hadn't been Imperial or Tau fighters, or even fricking Eldar for that matter. Every single one of the smaller craft had been a ramshackle contraption held together by a combination of spit, red paint, and a complete refusal to understand or even acknowledge the laws of fucking physics. God damn it. Why did it have to be orcs?
The occurrence border spent the next few days being as still and quiet as it possibly could. Meanwhile, everyone inside of it ran around in frenzy of preparation that put our earlier efforts to shame. Shame. None of it was directed towards improving the zone throat containment area anymore, though. Instead, it was all focused on keeping us alive long enough to capture the bloody thing. Armsmen drilled on repelling borders. The ship's lances were brought up to as close to functional as they'd ever been, and Tink finished getting everyone equipped with pulse weapons, while Theo put the final touches on Spot 2.0. The rest of us trained with our new weapons, and kept Twitch from doing anything crazier than usual. On the third day, we were all called up to the bridge by the captain. Well, actually only Sarge and the Adepts were called, but the rest of us were tired of all the horrible waiting. A very brief message telling us to hold the position and wait for secure comms contact was replayed for us. The captain told us that he hadn't seen any other vessels enter the system and didn't even have a hard source for the comm message, just a vague direction. That was rather disturbing, but no one except Twitch could figure out a way it could be a trap. The captain and Sarge decided to wait and see what happened next. After half an hour, another message came in. An incredibly deep voice that practically screamed Space Marines identified itself as Sergeant Gravis. Gravis? Alright guys, vote. Gravis or Gravis?
Gravis.
Gravis? Alright, Sergeant Gravis of the Emperor's side, and instructed us to lower our shields so he could dock. As the captain did so, Sarge squared his shoulders and picked up the Vox's headset, only to have the officer manning it tell him that we still didn't have a target for a secure channel. The man asked Sarge if he should just broadcast generally, and Sarge agreed. He got about halfway through introducing himself before the Marine Vox back, and told him to cease broadcasting before he alerted the whole system.
Sarge sheepishly hung up the Vox and vented some frustration by asking the communications officer what he meant by still didn't have a target. It was quickly revealed that the sensor still hadn't detected the Marine ship, despite it being close enough to worry about docking. The sensor's text claimed that the incoming ship must be shuttle-sized and must have some good stealth systems, but they were sure to spot it when it requested final docking instructions. Tank, not very quietly, suggested instead of the Marine ship being stealthy, that the tech systems were just complete shit. He then volunteered to have them upgrade to modern standards after the mission. The ensuing argument was brought to a halt by the Marine voxing again and telling us to reactivate our shields and close the shuttle bay doors. While most of us laughed at the sensor techs for not spotting a ship before it landed on us, Doc raised the question of where the Marines had landed. We hadn't actually opened any bays yet, unsurprisingly, given that they were the ones who patrolled the ship the most. Nubby and Twitch figured it out first. Both troopers screamed at Sarge to stop the Marine Sarge and the captain both caught on to what had happened at the same moment that the techs pinpointed the marine ship in the foremost bay on top of the Occurrence border, the one in the badly warp-tainted area near the prow, which was left open and airless at all times and was never to be used. The two normally stoic men frantically ran towards the communication officer and screamed at him to open a channel. In the background, a confused-sounding comm came in from the marine, asking why everything was so green and why there was a crewman without a void suit in the airless bay. Sarge won the sprint and had the Vox halfway to his mouth when the Marine's confused questions changed to reports of incoming hostiles.
Despite everything that happened afterward, Sarge's reaction was about as perfect as was possible. In his best non-comm voice, he bellowed at the Marine to disengage and pull his shuttle out of the bay. I'm not sure if you're familiar with how big and loud a Space Marine's voice is, but overriding one via pure volume and vitriol is a feat worthy of legend. Every time the Marine tried to argue or ask for clarification, Sarge just shouted over him in that parade ground voice he'd spent his entire life perfecting. This was probably him rolling as high as he possibly could. It was working, and everything might have turned out fine. If there hadn't been a second Marine, that is. The other Astartes, who'd been spared the full brunt of Sarge's wrath, cut in and asked his battle brother if he'd tarnished the chapter's honor by running like a squad of guardsmen without a commissar. The first Marine rallied and announced his intention to enter the bay and deal with the hostiles that were evading his shuttle's weapons. Sarge switched tactics and frantically tried to explain that there weren't any enemies, and opening the airlock would let the warp fungus in, but dissolved into furious cursing when he heard the shuttle's lock cycle. With a final growl of, "This isn't a battle, you idiot! It's sanitation! You're going to get yourself killed fighting fungus!" He handed the Vox unit over to Doc and the Adepts. Doc and everyone else with more charisma than a dead Felid slowly explained the situation to the Marine that hadn't just contaminated himself. The rest of us just stood there and listened to the sound of a Space Marine trying to kill Xenos that miraculously seemed to dodge every shot. Nubby and Amy started placing bets on how long it would be before the warp fungus, as we call it, ate through the Marine's power armor and whether the Marine would even be able to notice. No one gave him good odds. We all knew just how nasty the warp fungus could get. Hell, it'd been some of us who'd first discovered the crap.
Standard operating procedure in the Occurrence border was to just seal off any warp-tainted sections with nothing important inside. The lack of anything living to mess with kept the number of manifestations to a minimum, and anything that did appear usually faded before it could claw through the sealed bulkheads. Occasionally, though, something nastier than usual would appear and need dealing with. Nubby, Twitch, Fumbles, and recently Amy spent a lot of time watching for signs of this sort of stuff, and often got stuck with the job of fixing it. Anyways, the warp fungus was one of those nastier than usual things, but fixing it had been a bit of a problem. Fumbles had sort of heard it in the tainted shuttle bay months ago, back before we'd reached the Tau border worlds, in fact. He'd made such a fuss about the psychic noise it was emitting that Nubby and Twitch had agreed to risk a recon mission into the bay between warp jumps. They'd run in, pinpointed a large container labeled Potato Substitute 15 tons as the source of the noise. Because they were relatively savvy with how this sort of thing worked, they'd declined to actually open the container and just solved the problem the same way they solved most of the others, which is to say they covered it in dead packs. Well, at the time they declared a victory when the explosion went off and the psychic noise stopped, but in retrospect, that had only served to spread the fungus all over the bay. While the noise had returned, patrolling armsmen began reporting strange sounds and disappearing, and then other armsmen reported hearing or seeing missing ones. Over a dozen had vanished into the bay before Nubby and the rest took a second look. They found it covered with the fungus, which was in the process of dissolving everything less sturdy than the bay's blast-proof outer doors and walls. Also, it was filled with the missing armsmen, who were beckoning them inwards.
Nubby, Fumbles, and Twitch had immediately shut the door and ran for it. As they fled, a horde of orcs, gene stealers, and a few other variety of Xenos appeared at the end of the hall and blocked their escape. Fortunately, Fumbles was along and realized that the new enemies were some sort of psychic illusion. The Psyker was able to dispel the illusion without anything more serious than temporary reversal of gravity happening, and the debatably heroic trio escaped. There had been a few attempts to kill off the warp fungus after that. Unfortunately, between its caustic nature, the hallucinations, the fact that it was hellishly hard to kill, all that was accomplished was getting a few more armsmen and a whole lot of servitors melted. Eventually, someone suggested just voiding the bay, then leaving it until the stuff died. That didn't actually work, but it did cause the stuff to go dormant unless something ventured into the bay. Since we didn't actually use the bay for anything, the captain had decided the problem was no longer pressing and we got back to our way. As a precaution, Old Bill had reinforced a seal on the bay's doors and vents, and the only one allowed to go near it was one of the senior tech priests. The cogboy had some ideas about chemical sprayers deployed by servo skulls, and Jim had said he'd made some real progress, but the whole tech heresy thing had come up. Anyway, that's what the Space Marines had just landed in. A bay of psychically active, highly caustic, and incredibly hard to remove warp fungus. Honestly, though, it was still the third worst thing on the occurrence border they could have landed in. Our ship was a little overdue for a tune-up. But before we get to the next one, we are going to go on an ad break. We'll see you guys after the jump.
Welcome back from the ad break, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get right back into it. Through an absolutely heroic amount of persuasion, Doc and the Adepts managed to convince the Marines to abandon the bay. The second Marine, who identified himself as Sergeant Rebus, turned out to be very susceptible to logical arguments. It even helped talk Sergeant Gravis around before the fungus was able to melt through his boots. We still didn't forgive him for screwing up Sarge's initial attempt, though, because even if Gravis was going to be fine, he'd cycled his shuttle's airlock twice in the warp fungus bay. There was no fucking way that bird wasn't contaminated to hell and back. And we watched as not one, but two shuttles rose out of the bay. Neither of them looked anything like the Thunderhawks we'd expected when they told us we'd be working with Space Marines. Aside from being incredibly sleek, both of them were completely jet black and only visible because of our ship acting as a backdrop. One of them was definitely having a little trouble flying in a straight line, though, and showed up as a faint ghost on the sensor tech's scopes. The other remained stubbornly invisible to all scanners as it settled in space in front of the bridge. The decontamination process was not fast. The sprayer skulls had to be found and refilled, the contaminated shuttle had to be completely voided, and a holding area had to be set up. On top of that, the whole time this was going on, Sergeant Gravis and his shuttle's crew were, as Tink put it, tripping balls. Given how heavily armed they were, the situation was extremely very ultra uncomfortable, but luckily no one was killed and only one sprayer skull was destroyed. After hours and hours of tedious cleaning, not to mention very angry shouting about whose fault this all was, our team met with the Space Marines in the occurrence border's fanciest conference room. Our planning session was short, direct, and absolutely terrifying.
Those minis are sized of the Emperor and not Emperor's size, so I don't know what the fuck. I don't know if this is supposed to be size of the Emperor or what.
Boy, I sure hope somebody got fired for this blunder.
No response. Okay, I'll just keep going. Sergeant Gravis and Rebus, of the Emperor's size, Space Marine chapters were not what you'd call socialites. In fact, they were even more aloof than the few Marines we'd met previously. They stomped into the conference room still wearing their power armor, didn't even bother to remove their helmets. It was unnerving as hell talking to them, and Sarge couldn't hold on to his inquisitorial dignity in the face of those stares. Rebus did most of the talking, and started by explaining that there were two main objectives, and there would be two separate teams. The first team would consist of him and 4 scouts. The second team would consist of Sergeant Gravis and his 2 scouts, one of which would be piloting the shuttle, plus the interrogator sergeant and his 5 inquisitorial guardsmen. Sarge hesitantly asked if we'd need any support staff in the field. This triggered looks of terror from Jim Hanna and all the adepts, but Rebus said that they wouldn't be necessary. From the far end of the table, Fumbles held up his hand and asked if he was coming. The Marine considered this, and then asked if he was capable of using his powers while simultaneously fending off the hive mind's continuous psychic assault. Fumbles quietly put his hand back down. After waiting a few seconds to see if anyone else would interrupt, Rebus started explaining what the two teams would be doing. Our team would go to the 3rd planet in the system, then find and capture Zoanthrope. His team would destroy the hive ship orbiting it. Everyone in the room just sat there and stared at the Marines as Rebus started explaining the transportation situation and timeline. Tink managed to overcome a shock before anyone else, and loudly asked the Marines if they were insane / a second adjective that describes similar things to insane that I can't say.
Amy and Nubby snickered, and Doc hastily clapped a hand over Tink's mouth. Sarge took a deep breath and asked Sergeant Rebus to explain why, and more importantly, how the Marines were going to destroy an entire Tyranid hive ship. Rebus met Sarge's stare and said that his chapter's primary interest in the system was ensuring that the Tyranids did not overwhelm the Orcs and form a new splinter fleet. Capturing a live Zoanthrope for the Inquisition was merely a side mission, a small favor to be completed when convenient. As for how his team would board the hive ship and destroy it from within, further details were not for those outside the chapter. All we needed to know was that the ship would die after we captured the Zoanthrope, but before their psi suppressants could wear off and allow the hive mind to destroy the beast. As everyone digested this, Twitch broke his remarkably long silence. The demolitions trooper volunteered that the Marines probably had a vortex bomb, since an explosive would merely scatter still living pieces of ship across the planet, and a poison or virus would require a lot of sampling, plus a nearby laboratory. Both Marines glared at Twitch, who ignored them and went back to fiddling with the mine he was holding. After some more awkward silence, Sergeant Rebus went back to explain the mission details. Both teams would deploy in his stealth shuttle, since the warp fungus had gotten into the control systems of Gravis's. First, we'd insert his team on the hive ship, and then could go down to the planet to capture the zoanthrope. The occurrence boarder would follow us in on low power and stop at the edge of the hive ship's shadow, where it could easily warp out in an emergency. If our mission went quickly, we'd return it and drop off our prize before the shuttle was extracted. Before the shuttle extracted Rebus's team. Otherwise, we'd pick them up on the way back.
It slowly dawned on us that the Marines' plan called for us to sit as helpless passengers in a shuttle that would not only be carrying a notoriously unstable warp weapon, but would also be closing in on boarding range with a hive ship, even without the swarm of orc foiders attacking the ship, and the fact that we might make a second visit while that warp weapon was actually armed. It sounded incredibly dangerous. With them, not to mention the whole capturing a Xenopsyker thing, it sounded downright fucking suicidal. While the rest of us silently panicked, Doc hesitantly asked if it would make more sense to use both of the Marines' shuttles. Gravis, whose armor was sporting some truly impressive acid burns, glared at Doc and swore loud enough that we could hear him despite the fact that he didn't have his helmet speakers on. He bitterly suggested that we should have thought of that before neglecting the maintenance of our ship's shuttle bays, and then fell back into his sullen silence. Doc soldiered on despite this rebuttal and asked whether the mission could be delayed until our tech priests fixed the fungus shuttle. Jim and Hannah made some panicked gestures which seemed to imply that they had no freaking idea how the stealth shuttle even worked, much less how to fix it. Rebus ignored them, gave Doc a simple no, and announced that the briefing was over. We'd be leaving as soon as the scouts finished transferring equipment to the shuttle and Gravis' field repairs were completed. One of Gravis' scouts would deliver our mission-critical gear and explain the capture procedure to us in the meantime. With that, the two Marines stomped out. One by one, the Engineers, Adepts, and Fumbles followed them, leaving only us Guardsmen sitting there feeling like we'd lost all control of the situation.
Hold on, I'm chewing. Matt.
Okay.
Improvise.
You want me to read the next one?
No, improvise while I chew.
Jake facts. Jacob loves to eat yummy food in his belly. He loves it in his belly. It's so yummy. It's so yummy and so good.
Okay, thank you. Now, we'd felt out of our depth. We'd felt out of our depth before. Hell, that had been our default state of mind since the Inquisition drafted us. This was worse than usual, though. The Marines had left us feeling like children. It wasn't embarrassment over the shuttle thing. That was at least as much fault theirs as ours. It was just that we felt incredibly outclassed by the 3-meter-tall killing machines. It was odd that the two Marines were so daunting, since, as Twitch pointed out, we'd actually killed 3 Chaos Space Marines during our missions. Doc suggested that the issue was that they were on our side. The ones we killed were vile traitors, deserving of nothing with scorn and death, but these were 2 physical manifestations of the Emperor's divine wrath. Or to put it more simply, we couldn't compensate for our discomfort by trying to kill them. Twitch was halfway through suggesting that shooting the Marines just a little would make us feel better, when Gravis' scout came in. That was a very, very awkward moment, but the scout eventually accepted that it was just a little joke. None of us would even consider doing such a thing, and we certainly didn't dedicate large amounts of our time to planning complex betrayals of our allies. Well, unless they were Eldar, or tech priests, or deserters, or cultists, or heretics, or annoying interrogators, or commissars, rogue traders, rival inquisitorial teams, or people who might be orcs in disguise. But since the Marines and their scouts were none of these things, there was obviously nothing to worry about. Unless they really were orcs, they were much bigger and musclier than normal people after all. Sarge put a stop to Twitch's newest paranoid fantasy before it got started, and asked the scout what was in the crates on the pallet he was pushing. The scout eyed us all dubiously, and said it was our grav chutes. All of us digested the horrible implications of those 2 words and went quiet. Except for Nubby, that is, who was a little slower on the uptake.
Grav what?
Shoots.
What shoots?
Grav chutes.
What?
You're Guardsman. You should know what grav chutes are. You know, small backpack-sized anti-gravitate devices that allow Imperial troops to float safely to the ground on a column of anti-gravitic force from any height in a world's gravity well, including suborbital heights.
Oh, you mean Screamy Folly Death Packs? Yeah, we're familiar with those. What you doing with them? Because I know a guy who's a guy who knows a guy who knows another.
They're for you to deploy in the shuttle with. You just said you're familiar with them. Surely I don't need to draw you a picture.
What? Are you mental? When I say familiar, I mean we pulled a bunch of them off deaders. None of us have ever used one. You can tell because we're not pancake-shaped.
That's unfortunate. You have 2 hours to learn how to operate one. I'll assist in your training. Is there a nearby cargo bay or lift shaft we can use?
The baby spaceman is trying to kill us, son! Why is everyone always trying to kill us, son?
The best term for our training with the graph shoots was crash course. The scout marine had made sure our shoots were on, walked us to the edge of the shaft, and pushed us off. He claimed it was how he'd been trained, and the man evidently saw no reason why non-superhumans should learn any differently. Sarge didn't let anyone argue. There wasn't time. None of us enjoyed the experience of being thrown into a lift shaft with nothing but an underpowered anti-grav unit and a pair of tiny thrusters between us and pancakey death. It was hard to say who did the worst. It was a pretty much three-way tie. Doc had so little control that he got stuck on a light fixture and had to be rescued by the scout. The humiliation of being suspended by his pants halfway up the shaft was slightly overshadowed by the way the scout had just cut them off and insisted he keep practicing instead of getting a new pair. While the scout was busy with Doc's rescue, Tank decided that he could convert his chute into a full jump pack using some of the techniques he picked up working on his drone. It turned out he was wrong, so much in fact that he had to be issued the only spare chute. Of course, Tank immediately declared that he knew what he'd done wrong and started to retry the modifications using his replacement chute. Sarge had to take his tools away. Finally, Amy misinterpreted a suggestion to wear a helmet as a comment on her hair. She tried to deck the scout and found a Space Marine's jaw is a lot tougher than any non-augmetic hand. Doc, still pantsless, checked the hand and said it wasn't broken, so Amy grumpily resumed her training. For his part, the Scout Marine took the irrational attack in stride, but that was obviously the point where we lost the last of our credibility in his eyes.
Despite all the difficulties and our teacher's absolute and utter disgust with us, we all managed to get down the shaft safely a few times before the training ended. We gathered up our gear, got Doc some new pants, and made our way to the bay where the unfungused stealth shuttle was being prepped. Once there, the Scout Marine brought out an impressively large sniper rifle and explained how the Zoanthrope's capture would work. We noticed that, unlike the previous lesson, this briefing consisted of nothing but short words and included a lot of hand gestures as well as a few pictures. None of us commented, but Amy and Tink were obviously taking note of every little implied insult. The gist of the plan was that the stealth shuttle would sweep over the battlefield until we saw a Zoanthrope. The shuttle would fly over the target, and then everyone but the pilot would deploy via grav chute. From there, speed was the name of the game. The estimated mission length was 10 minutes if our insertion was undetected, and 3 if it was. If we took any longer, Tyranid reinforcements would freaking bury us. Our squad would secure a perimeter and hold it against any Tyranids that came to support the Zoanthrope. While Sergeant Gravis wore down the Xeno's psychic shield bubble thing, and once the shield was breached, the scout would shoot the Zoanthrope with a specially tailored sedative and psi suppressant, and then we'd all fall back to the nearest possible landing area for extraction. It was the complete opposite of all the horribly complex ops we'd suffered through since joining the Inquisition. It was the ultimate in simple, straightforward planning. If it wasn't for the fact that we'd be outnumbered literally thousands, if not millions to one, we would have fucking loved it. As it was, though, there is no word to describe how much we hated this plan. Honestly, all of us, even Sarge, would have bailed if the 2 Space Marines hadn't shown up. None of us had the nerve to refuse the Astartes, so we boarded the shuttle and headed off to our absolutely certain deaths.
Oh my god, that's art of Uriel Ventress.
Oh my god.
Look at the green shoulder pad and the sword.
Oh my god.
The shuttle trip into the system was amazingly unpleasant. It wasn't that the stealth shuttle was crowded. There was only 13 of us in it, or 15 if you counted the seats taken by Spot and the Vortex Bomb, and the seats themselves weren't that bad either. Sure, they were a little on the big side, but Space Marines definitely spare a bit more budget for comfort when building a ship than the Guard does. So the ship was fine. The problem was the atmosphere being generated by our fellow passengers. They were too quiet. See, if it were a guard shuttle, everyone would have been complaining, joking, or smoking. Even the driest Inquisition teams we've been assigned to would have at least done some gear checks or reminded us stupid guardsmen what our job was. The Marines and their scouts just sat there and silently prayed or meditated or something. No talking, no moving, and hardly any breathing for hours upon hours. You'd think we could just ignore it, but anytime one of us made the slightest bit of noise, the entire creepy lot would glare at us like, well, noisy children in a chapel. The sounds were on our nerves. There was nothing to do but think about the upcoming mission or stare in the ominous bulk of the vortex bomb, which was making the sort of unbearable or unhearable noises we associated with the weak Geller field. We were all reaching our limit, and it was a race to see if Twitch or Amy would snap first, when Sarge decided that politeness was overrated. He commandeered one of Twitch's camo tarps and hung it across the shuttle interior, walling away all the creepy superhumans except for Grass as a scout. The big guy tried to glare us down by himself, as we all started being as noisy as we damn well pleased, but we had him outnumbered, and Sarge threatened to put a second tarp over him if he kept it up.
The remainder of our approach to the Tyranid hive ship was spent the usual ways. Tink tinkered with Spot 2.0, removing the overweight skull probe disguise and trying to get a few of the systems he and Theo hadn't finished clutching together functional. Doc wrote his usual soppy "if I die on this mission" letter to his girlfriend, while Amy and Nubby read over his shoulder and made unhelpful suggestions. Twitch muttered to himself as he imagined hundreds of scenarios involving Tyranids and orcs. As his mind ran its quicker than usual circles, he continuously moved gear and explosives between his bag and the massive pile of spares he'd bought. Sarge walked as we frittered away our time and saw that it was good. We'd all suffered a moment of heart failure as Sergeant Rebus tore down the tarp, followed by another when the homemade cluster mine Twitch had been holding hit the floor. The Space Marine stood there and waited while we picked springs and thanked the Emperor unarmed explosives from under our seats. When the last bomblet had been collected, Rebus informed us that the shuttle was nearing the hive ship, and we would be switching to full stealth mode. We were to secure ourselves in our gear, put on our rebreathers, and stay out of his team's way while they deployed. We did as ordered, and a few minutes later, the shuttle ride went from boring to terrifying. The cabin switched to the emergency lights, the air vents stopped blowing, and the gravity deactivated. We floated in our seats for a few seconds, then the first evasive maneuver hit us. Let me tell you, no one thinks about those gravs tied to a shuttle's engine seriously until they're turned off. Instead of the usual little jolts of spillover, they were as long, continuous pulls in seemingly random directions. We felt completely helpless as we bounced and swung in our crash harnesses. Then Tank decided that we might be better if we could see what was coming and anticipate the maneuvers. It was not.
Who knows what the Marines and Scouts thought when Spot 2.0 drifted past them and entered the cockpit. They didn't actually say anything about it, and were already glaring at us for how loudly we were complaining about the turbulence. Anyway, they seemed just as interested as us when Tink projected the drone's vid feed on the front bulkhead, and we all stared at the image of the massive Tyranid bioship looming in front of us, and then at the smaller ships swarming around it. It was hard to say if there were more orc fighters or Tyranid flyers, and either way there was a constant stream of reinforcements rising from the planet and spewing from the hive ship. It was complete chaos. The space around the hive ship was filled with rockets, shells, bioplasma, pyro acid, and millions of tons of wildly spinning debris. And for some reason, we were flying right the fuck into it. Bloody Space Marines. All of us just sat there and stared, and then when we saw the cause of one of those evasive maneuvers, a speck suddenly grew into a fighter and then zipped past by such a thin margin that we could see the orc piloting it. A split second later, it was followed by a stream of bioplasma and a Tyranid interceptor. Doc swallowed, Twitch whimpered, and Amy swore. Variations of that scene repeated dozens and dozens of times as we closed within the hive ship's reach. It's hard to say which was more amazing, the way the Scout Marine pilot twisted away from every single impact with bare meters to spare, or the fact that none of the hostiles even saw our shuttle, even while nearly colliding with it. Our slow approach to the hive ship through that space battle was a terrifying and humbling reminder that if Guardsman's nerves are steel, Space Marines are adamantium. Not that we actually had what you might call nerves of steel. All of us were scared shitless, and when the pilot took cover from a pyro acid barrage behind a Landa that was visibly filled with commandos, Twitch went from scared to full-on freaking out, man!
When Twitch started gibbering, Sarge barked orders at Tink and Doc to turn off the projection and prep a trank, but none of us had anywhere near the same speed as the panicked demolitions trooper. In a startlingly short amount of time, Twitch had cut his way out of his crash harness and relocated to a more defensible position, leaving a trail of jetpacks floating in the air behind him. Said defensible position turned out to be the small amount of space between the vortex bomb and the seat that held it. Sarge immediately undid his own restraints and launched himself across the shuttle, only to wind up pinned against a pair of unhappy Scout Marines as the pilot evaded something or other. A rain of jetpacks landed on everyone on that side of the shuttle, Guardsman and Marine alike, and Sergeant Gravis had decided that enough was enough. Enough was enough. The Space Marine's boots adhered to the floor with a deep clang as he left his seat. Most of us watched in amazement, and the Space Marine slowly stomped across what the shuttle's acceleration meant was actually a wall. Twitch, though, was honestly too busy with his paranoid panic attack to notice until a massive hand snapped out, pulled the detonator from his grip. That is, Sergeant Gravis had probably thought that removing the detonator would neatly defuse the situation. He was completely wrong, of course, but as the theft did focus Twitch's attention on him instead of imaginary commandos. Unfortunately, that attention took the form of a thrown object, which adhered to the Space Marine's hand when he tried to bat it away.
We could practically hear the gears in Sergeant Gravis's head whirring as he registered the det pack stuck to his palm and the two detonators which had practically materialized in Twitch's hands. The giant in the acid-pocked armor stared into the wild eyes of the demolitions trooper, who was currently lying across a vortex bomb and accusing of being one of them, and decided that the intimidation and force were not viable options. So in the gentlest voice, a half-ton hybrid of man and tank can manage, he tried to reason. Gravis started by asking Twitch to calm down. That worked about as well as you'd expect. The Space Marine then tried explaining that there were no enemies in the shuttle and everyone here was Twitch's ally. Twitch responded by chucking another det pack at him and screaming, "That's what they all say, then the mask comes off." That seemed to confuse Gravis, so Doc helpfully explained that he'd just been accused of being an orc in disguise. Gravis pointed out that Twitch was obviously insane, which won him another det pack and a scream of, "They all say that too." At that point, Gravis must have been losing confidence in his strategy, because he turned as asked the rest of us what to do. Nubby, Amy, and Tank all simultaneously made unhelpful suggestions, and Sarge was busy clinging onto Sergeant Rebus's seat, as yet another evasive maneuver tried to fling him from across the shuttle. Doc told the Marine that he was doing fine. This sort of argument was pretty much standard operating procedure if no one managed to trank Twitch before he got the explosives out. He suggested that Gravis continue by taking off his helmet and proving that he wasn't an orc. Twitch agreed that the orc should show us his real face, so he did. Tank's shout of, "What happened to your..." was cut off by Doc's hand. Amy cackled until Nubby pointed out that the Marine still had most of his hair. Sarge asked what was going on, and Twitch admitted that Gravis probably wasn't an orc. Probably.
In the incredibly, painfully awkward silence that followed, Sergeant Gravis put his helmet back on, his scout marine glared at us, and Twitch asked if someone would please help me get off the vortex bomb, I'm stuck. Gravis collected both Twitch and Sarge, who was still clinging to the meditating Sergeant Rebus for dear life, and deposited them both in their seats. As the Marine stomped around, he talked to us, giving us a morale-boosting lecture he claimed was given to him as an acolyte on his first boarding mission. We were instructed not to worry about what we couldn't control, and to focus on remembering glorious victories of the chapter, or in our case, the Cadian regiments. Nubby asked what was so special about those nutters. This caused a pause in the motivational speech. It was eventually established that our regiment wasn't from Cadia, Catachan, Krieg, Elysia, Maccabeus, Mordian, Talon, Vestroyer, or any other world famous for its contribution to the Guard. Furthermore, our regiment had never accomplished anything other than serving as cannon fodder for more important Imperial forces. There were no glorious victories for us at all. At an indignant objection from our markswoman, this was adjusted to no glorious victories for anyone except Amy and her Nubby regiment of Nubby Nubs. Sergeant Gravis stared at us, then asked what in the Emperor's name we were doing in the fucking Inquisition. Sarge sighed, picked at a stray det pack which had adhered to his sleeve, and admitted that not a day went by that he didn't ask himself that same damn question.
The rest of the approach to the hive ship passed without incident, at least as far as his passengers were concerned, that is. The pilot definitely had to dodge a whole lot of something over the last few minutes, though. Thank the Emperor, Tank never turned the video feed back on. At a word from the pilot, Sergeant Rebus and his 4 Scout Marines sprang out of their seats and positioned themselves around the vortex bomb. A few moments later, there was a squishy impact, and the stealth shuttle's rear door opened to reveal a pulsating wall of flesh stuff. The Scouts painted it with something. Rebus stabbed it with his power sword, and a gap was pried open. To our disgust, the 5 Marine boarding party then smeared themselves with the juices running from the gap. Once they and the vortex bomb were good and covered, they pulled on some camellia-line cloaks that looked far better than any that had ever been issued to us in the lowly Guardsmen, and climbed through. Sergeant Gravis planted a probe-looking device in the gap behind them and sealed it with some big staple things and some chemical spray. When the gap was closed, we heard Gravis and Rebus do a comm check and schedule the pickup. Then the shuttle door was silently closed, and we started drifting away. From docking to undocking, the whole boarding operation took just under 5 minutes. It was the most impressive display of efficient professionalism we'd ever seen, but I'm not sure any of us drew a breath during the whole thing. We all prayed to the Emperor that we wouldn't have to be on the shuttle during their pickup. There's a moral about getting what you wish for in there sometimes. Somewhere, some place, somewhere. Sergio, take us home before I have a stroke from reading too much.
We descended to the planet alongside the hail of spores spewing from the hive ship. It went a lot faster and required fewer evasive maneuvers than our approach had, which was good for our frayed nerves. Now that Sergeant Rebus and his team of suicidal supermen had departed, Gravis and his scouts became a little more chatty. The scout piloting the shuttle brought the gravity up enough to keep us in our seats and told Gravis that he was starting scans. Gravis brought out an oversized data slate and began staring at it with the other scout. They didn't seem to think that we really needed to take part in the discussion, but when Tank sent his drone to hover over their shoulders, Gravis decided it would be easier to let us participate. Gravis and his two scouts were searching the battlefield below us for signs of zoanthropes. Specifically, they were looking for big old bolts of warp lightning, which could be traced back to the Xenopsyker firing them. That sounds fairly simple, but given how far up we still were and how much of a mess this battlefield was, we decided that it was pointless to try and help. While the Marines strained their eyes, the rest of us concentrated the sort of things us lowly guardsmen find important, namely weather, terrain, and hostile positions. These turned out to be acid rain, a wasteland with giant spiky rocks, and everywhere. In short, it wasn't a place we wanted to get anywhere near, much less drop onto via a grav chute. Nubby and Tank started the argument by complaining about the suicidal nature of the mission and suggesting that we just lie on the report, which prompted the Scout Marine to tell us all about how to grow a backbone and a proper sense of fighting duty. Amy told him where he could stick his backbone and sense of duty, and things went downhill from there. Sadly, this wasn't a real good fight going. We'd only managed to get a bit of name-calling and a few anatomically improbable threats, before Gravis finally spotted some warp lightning. Lighting? That should be lightning, but it's like it's misspelled Chain of Memories lighting.
Oh my god, she's back! It's lighting from Chain of Memories!
The PTSD. This is really good.
That would be exactly how that her other form would be spelled too. Warp lighting. With the dash.
Warp lighting. Warp dash lighting.
This was quite fun. I look forward to seeing how it concludes.
Yeah, I like the funny Space Marines just being like mind boggled.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that we get some good orc dialogue, because I liked the orc dialogue that was in the, I can't remember what chapter it was in. Was it they're orc pirates, I believe, or maybe they were just regular pirates. But I remember it being funny.
Freebooters is the word you're looking for?
Yeah, the freebooters.
Yeah, the freebooters.
Yeah, because I remember the freebooters before. Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking about. Also, the mission accomplished that they uses, I didn't want to take the time to go and grab that image, but I was going to post it in the server when we hit 10,000 views. For those who hadn't seen our Twitter post, we are now above 10,000.
You could have just Googled George Bush mission accomplished, and I promise you it probably would have picked up.
I didn't feel like putting the effort in.
So how long do you think it'll be before they meet Rabute Gilliman in All Guardsmen?
Probably never. Considering they're like old head Warhammer fans, they probably hate the existence of Rabute Gilliman in modern 40k.
Probably. All right, well, I look forward to the next reading.
Yeah.
We love you.
Join us next time. I don't love you, though. Dab, dab, dab.
Yeah, fuck you, yeah.
Good evening, or morning, or afternoon, or dark hour at the darkest point of night. Anybody who's listening. So you think you can ban us back to read another part of All Guardsmen Party? I bet.
doing my Jacob and turning up.
He's shitting
Hello.
himself. What, should we just let him continue to shit himself?
I mean, I have a funny little anecdote about a book. So he
About
thinks
shitting
he's
yourself?
shitting himself. Well, no, about a book that's not about shitting yourself. I was saying that Matt can just like shit himself while I tell the story. Don't actually like make the noises while I tell it.
Okay.
So I work at a bookstore, which my time on that is slowly running out, because we're getting closed down, because the school didn't renew our contract, and it's a whole thing. But
first they did it to Moe's, now they're doing it to your job. This is truly what the liberal agenda wants.
Being that the student congress is the one who advocated for this change, kind of, yes, it is the liberal agenda taking us out. I was working an author event today, and we didn't get to sit on the author event. We were outside of it, but we had the books, and basically this author, I can't remember her name,
Chuck Dixon.
but it's not Chuck Dixon.
I think it was like Hero Q.
I think it was like Rebecca Nix or something like that. And a former OU student wrote a fantasy novel, and I was looking through it because I was just like, well, I want to see if this book is any good. And like the prose in it seemed fine. I didn't like take the time to like read the whole thing because I had stuff to work on my laptop. But the acknowledgments page, which I went to the end of because I wanted to see how long the book was, has a very funny like little anecdotes. The last paragraph of the acknowledgments said, I don't know if you can thank Taylor Swift and the creators of Avatar: The Last Airbender in an acknowledgement page, but I'm gonna do that. Like that's verbatim what it said, and we were just like laughing. Like I was like, this is so based.
I'm pretty sure that's what an acknowledgement page is for. To be fair,
she also thanked all of her Patreon patrons, but didn't name them. Like, come on, at least put their names in there.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Are we ready to dive in?
Yes, sirree.
No, I actually want to have a 45-hour discussion on you shitting yourself. You need to stop, man.
I'm pretty sure I've gone to the bathroom less times in my life than you have for the purposes of shitting myself.
I haven't shit myself in a long time, man. First of all, that was hurtful and rude.
Well, how about you prove it by reading the next entry in all Guardsmen Party? And I believe
linking me the episode or linking me the chapter.
Why can you not go to the fucking website and just
I have
grab
no
it?
eyes. I have no
It's literally
shoes.
just the allgarzapparty.com.
I don't have hands.
No brain, no eyes, no hands, no gender, no Twitter, no balls, no cum.
Is it the Space Marine orgasming?
Blood
Angel with his hands touching his face?
That's not the that's the one that we read last time, I'm quite sure. And then we go on after that.
There's a moral about getting what you wish for in there somewhere?
Yes, that's where we ended, I'm pretty sure. There's
a
moral, but getting what you wish for in there somewhere.
Am I starting or am I twerking?
You're after that line, there's a moral. That's where you start. The next entry after the Red Space Marine.
That was a fucking disgusting burp. I want you to cut that out. I regret that.
It was awful.
We descended to the planet alongside the hail of spores spewing from the hive ship. It went a lot faster and required fewer evasive maneuvers than our approach had, which was good for our frayed nerves. Now that Sergeant Rebus and his team of suicidal supermen had departed, Gravis and his scouts became a little more chatty. The scout piloting the shuttle brought the gravity up enough to keep us in our seats and told Gravis that he was starting scans. Gravis brought out an oversized data slate and began staring at it with the other scout. They didn't seem to think that we really needed to take part in the discussion, but when Tink set his drone to hover over their shoulders, Gravis decided it was easier to just let us participate. Gravis and his two scouts were searching the battlefield below us for signs of zoanthropes. Specifically, they were looking for big old bolts of warp lightning which could be traced back to the Xenopsyker firing them. That sounded fairly simple, but given how far up we still were and how much of a mess the battlefield was, we decided that it was pointless to try and help. While the Marines strained their eyes, the rest of us concentrated at the sort of things us lonely guardsmen find important, namely the weather, terrain, and hostile positions. These turned out to be acid rain, wasteland with giant spiky rocks, and everywhere. It's like I'm imagining the wasteland that Goku and Vegeta fought in.
Yes.
That's what I'm imagining.
Probably accurate.
And he's just
Ugh.
like, Kakarot, you try not to
Kakarot,
come
you can't fire that bolter. Come
Kakarot,
on.
try not to come challenge. In short, within a place we wanted to get anywhere near, much less drop into via grav chute. Nubby and Tink started the argument by complaining about the suicidal nature of the mission and suggested that we just lie down on the report, which prompted the Scout Marine to tell us to all grow a backbone and a proper sense of duty. Amy told him where he could stick his backbone and sense of duty, and things went downhill from there. Sadly, there wasn't time to get a real good fight going. We only managed a bit of name-calling and a few anatomically improbable threats before Gravis finally spotted some warp lightning.
Sarge, Doc, and Twitch stared at the data slate with the Marine. The section of the battlefield he was looking at was a complete free-for-all between the orcs and the Nids, and a particularly dense cluster of jagged rocks was emitting bursts of lightning. Gravis said that the frequency of the bolts indicated that it was a lone psyker, and went on to point out that the position was not strongly defended against an airborne insertion. He suggested that we move on the target immediately, before it was killed or the battle shifted. But Doc and Sarge didn't like that they couldn't see inside the pile of rock the psyker was hiding in. Twitch was Twitch. Sarge asked Gravis how he was sure that A, there wasn't a whole hive's worth of Nids in there, and, at Twitch's insistence, B, that the lightning-shooting Xenos wasn't actually an orc. Gravis just glared down at us and said that he was about 73% certain this was an acceptable target. Our fearless leader tried to stare down the Space Marine for about 5 seconds, then decided that sort of decision, not to mention arguing with an Astartes, was above his pay grade. Sarge rounded on the rest of us and started bellowing orders to prep for deployment. Tink got spot stealthed up and verified that our scopes were synced. Nubby and Amy flung a few final insults at the Scout Marine. Doc tried to remember which button was on his grav chute, and Twitch angrily grabbed the last armful of explosives while muttering about no one taking orcs seriously. When everyone was ready, we formed up behind Sergeant Gravis and his scout. A few minutes later, the shuttle hatch slammed open. Space Marine stepped out into the air and dropped out of sight. Sarge then followed him to the edge, looked down, and froze as he saw just how far down and covered with pointy things in Xenos the ground was. Then the Space Scout Marine pushed him.
Now, just to be clear, while there are entire regiments of guardsmen dedicated to doing grav drops, the rest of us think they're fucking insane. Even your average catechin will call an Elysian or any other type of drop trooper an adrenaline-hungry madman. And mind you, that's coming from someone who would gleefully try to kill a war boss with nothing but a combat knife. I mean, who in their right mind flies all the way to the battlefield in a perfectly functional shuttle, then jumps out of it while it still has a click off the fucking ground? Anyway, dropping through the air towards a pile of rocks that resembled nothing so much as a giant demonic hedgehog was not on the list of things we joined the guard to do. The fact that there was a hostile psyker inside said rocks, not to mention the bloody melee of orcs and Tyranids all around, did not make it any more attractive. If it wasn't for the fact that Sergeant Gravis was already on the ground and clearing our landing area, we all would have stayed in that shuttle. Also, the Scout Marine kept pushing us. Despite how unpleasant we found the drop, the painfully direct training we'd received meant we all made it down in one piece. One piece doesn't mean cleanly, though. Only Sarge and Nubby made what could be called good landings, and that's only if you count landing on an unsuspecting orc and Hormagaunt as good. Doc and Amy wound up colliding with each other in the air and made an awkward dual landing on one of the jagged spires. Amy managed to stick the landing and started picking off targets, but Doc wound up sliding off and bouncing to the ground like a terrified pinball. Tink outright stopped his descent by having Spot come up under him. He happily shot into the melee from his perch until a flesh borer to the leg reminded him that hanging in the air where there is no cover and everyone can see you is a terrible fucking idea. Luckily, he landed next to Doc. Twitch did not hit anything, but he swerved around a lot for some reason.
Sergeant Gravis had cleared us a beachhead. And those of us who hadn't gotten shot or cracked a rib on the way down widened it. This was our first chance to use the pulse weapons. Tink and Theo had disguised for us on soft targets, and it was glorious. No heresy intended, but Tau carbines blow lasguns out of the water. They hit harder than a hot shot and reload easier too. We were dropping nids and orcs left and right, and it was gratifying to see Sergeant Gravis stop and stare at us when he ran out of enemies. Space Marine didn't stop for long or ask about our sexier than standard issue weapons. Once he was sure we had the perimeter on lockdown, he switched to his power sword and made his way towards the cluster of fallen spires that was occasionally illuminated by blasts of lightning. The scout, who was perched similarly to Amy and had stolen at least 3 of her kills, I emphasized a totally wrong word. I just realized. Her kills. Started following his boss by jumping from spire to spire. The official plan called for us to leave them to it. We were just supposed to secure a landing area for the shuttle and keep reinforcements out. We were doing far better than expected, though, and Sarge started feeling I'm this big Inquisition guy who actually helped instead of just following orders. So he followed Gravis to lend a hand with a zoanthrope, and Twitch tagged along for his own reasons. The rest of us were more than happy to stay put and keep shooting any orcs or Tyranids that wandered our way. Looking back, holding that perimeter was far too easy. There was never a concentrated attack on our position, just the occasional Xenos who retreated in our direction, or was checking out what all the plasma fire was coming from. We thought that the Xenos were just keeping each other at bay. The Tyranids weren't pouring in to reinforce their psychic artillery unit because the orcs were in the way. We didn't realize that something had gone wrong until Sergeant Gravis flew out of the side of the rock pile.
Well, not flew exactly. More like was thrown. Something like 1.5 tons of power-armored Space Marines sailed through the air like a thing that is very bad at sailing, crashed through 4 of the smaller rock pillars, and barely activated its gravity in time to dodge a fatal collision with a larger 5th. Doc tried to ask Sarge what the hell just happened, but our fearless leader was busy screaming, swearing, and firing his pulse carbine on full auto. When Doc tried again, Twitch cut in a slightly hysterical tone, told us that Sarge was busy right now. He suggested that anyone who wanted to live should get some cover between themselves and the rock pile. We didn't need telling twice. Since we were keeping our heads far down as was anatomically possible, it turned out that Sarge was half blind, and Twitch wound up getting a nasty concussion. No one really saw what happened next. Luckily, Spot recorded the whole thing. A few seconds after Twitch's warning, he and Sarge came out of the rock pile at a dead sprint. They dove behind the first pillars they could find, and a split second later, the entire cluster of collapsed pillars exploded. 3 green, glowing projectiles were propelled out of the hole, while Sarge and Twitch had exited and splattered apart against the rock Amy was perched on. One of them, or a random piece of debris, must have clipped Twitch's pillar 2, because a sizable chunk broke off the top and nailed him on the helmet. He managed to daze "told you so" before collapsing. In the aftermath, Doc ran over to check on Twitch and Sarge. The rest of us kept our eyes on the perimeter, except for Amy. She descended from her gore-covered perch with a cry of, "Oh God, it's everywhere. I think I got some down my shirt. Tell me this isn't mashed Tyranids." Sarge blearily sat up and told her not to worry. It was only mashed orcs. This did not improve Amy's mood.
Sarge calmed Gravis, verified that both the Marines had survived the blast, and made sure the shuttle was on its way to pick us back up. While we waited and shot the occasional orc or nid that took an interest in us, Sarge explained what had happened inside of the rock pile. Sarge had followed Gravis down a sort of tunnel that headed towards where the warp lighting was coming from. The Space Marine had been sprinting ahead and had obviously intended to rush the Psyker with his power sword before it could notice and fry him with lightning. Sarge caught up just in time to see Gravis exit the tunnel and pull off the close to melee range part of the plan, but the Xenopsyker hadn't been the frail ranged support unit they had expected. Instead, Sergeant Gravis wound up face-to-face with a big old psychic, not to mention psychotic and psychopathic orc. To the Space Marine's credit, he hadn't hesitated at all. He'd waded right in and started chopping and stabbing while Sarge gave covering fire. Unfortunately, the weird boy had a bunch of bodyguards, and they brought him enough time to do some warpy stuff. Sarge said the moral of the story was, if a warp energy-infused orc charges you with supernatural speed and a big glowy stick, it is a much better idea to dodge his swing than to try to block it with your power sword. So when the Space Marine got knocked out of the park, Sarge decided it was time to leg it. He'd made liberal use of his flash grenades and nearly ran into Twitch on his way out. Twitch had apparently been picking out the detonators for the jetpacks he'd, without bothering to tell anyone, dropped all over the rock pile on his way down. Anyway, Sarge held the weird boy and his surviving minders off long enough for Twitch to sort out which button he wanted to press, and they got out of the pile a few seconds ahead of the explosion. The orcs had not, which was why Amy was picking pieces of them off of her armor.
Sergeant Gravis and his scout rejoined us just as Sarge finished his story. Nubby, ever the diplomat, asked if their bug hunt had gone as well as our perimeter securing had. Amy and Tink snickered, but Sarge shut the three of them up. The two Marines didn't look like they were in the mood for any bullshit. They're wearing helmets. How do they know?
What were they thinking? I hope someone got fired for that writing blunder.
Damn.
Between the acid damage and the new sets of dents and scratches, Gravis's armor was beginning to look rather ragged, and the scout looked even worse. He'd apparently been trying to find a hole in the top of the pile to snipe through, and didn't have the same hardwired response to a warning from Twitch that us guardsmen did. His stealth cloak was completely ruined, plus there were at least 2 sizable holes in his Caribus armor. He was still alive, though, and rather rudely turned down Doc's offer to patch him up. So we figured he was fine and had learned an important lesson about warnings from Demolition's troopers. The stealth shuttle dropped out of the clouds above us. We got back into the air without further incident. All of us more or less collapsed into the oversized seats, despite the fact that we'd only been on the ground for about 15 minutes, and only 2 of us had been noticeably injured. We were exhausted. Our rest didn't last long, though, despite the perfectly reasonable suggestions some of us made concerning calling the mission off and pinning the blame on Mr. 73% certain it's an acceptable target. Sarge and Gravis both immediately started searching for another Xeno-Psyker.
By the time we'd finished reloading, they found a slightly less rock-covered hilltop that was emitting lightning. This we had a clear view of, and the lightning was obviously coming from a snaky-looking Xenos, which perfectly matched the images of zoanthropes that we'd seen. Gravis and the scout did not find it amusing when Sarge asked for Twitch's opinion anyway. Luckily for everyone's nerves, Twitch was too concussed to be smugged, and simply agreed that the bug looked like a bug. As our shuttle neared the hill, we realized that this drop was going to be nastier than the last. This time, instead of a free-for-all, the hill was clearly in Tyranid hands, claws, whatever, and it looked fairly critical to the local battle with the greenskins. The Nids definitely weren't going to let us wipe out their artillery without a fight. They'd reinforce it as heavily as they could manage. Perimeter duty would not be another cakewalk, and if it took too long to subdue the Psyker, we'd be up our asses in bugs. Sarge quickly split us into pairs, assigned us to the 3 main approaches to the hill, and convinced Twitch to share his mines with us. We'd clear the area, push out, and then plant the mines, and fall back towards the top if things got hairy. Before anything more complex could be put together, we reached the DZ. Sergeant Gravis was the first one down again. He leaned out the rear hatch, sighted the zoanthrope, and pretty much dropped right on top of the Psyker. The rest of us followed out as quickly and professionally as we could manage. None of us even had to be pushed out of the shuttle by the scout this time.
Every single one of us landed with our weapons firing. There were 7 or 8 termagants keeping the zoanthrope company, and only one of them was still alive when we hit the ground. Sarge finished that one off when we all fanned out towards our assigned areas. We moved fast, motivated by a desire to get our choke points set up before reinforcements arrived, and to get something solid between us and Gravis's fight with the zoanthrope. Honestly, we hadn't taken the Space Marine too seriously up to that point. I mean, we respected him and found him daunting as fucking hell, but his combat performance in the last drop hadn't been up to the stories you hear about Space Marines. His fight with the Tyranid Psyker, though, that was something to tell your grandkids about. In a few seconds we saw him fighting before we got under cover. Sergeant Gravis baited out and dodged 3 massive lightning bolts, scored twice as many hits on the Xenos' shield bubble, and generally moved with more speed and grace than should have been conceivably possible for something that big and heavy. Abstractly, we'd known that the Emperor's Sides chapter were the best experts available when it came to fighting Tyranids, but watching Gravis play that zoanthrope like a fiddle really drove it home. We all would have stopped to spectate if the zoanthrope's misses weren't blowing the rocks near us into red-hot shrapnel. Anyway, we all got the hell off that hilltop and into a good position. Spot stayed up high and gave us a good view of the incoming reinforcements as we set our mines and found the best lines of fire. We all finished our preparations just in time and started mowing down the first wave of Tyranids as they climbed the hill.
The first wave was nothing but the gaunts, both varieties. That had been near the hill. Thanks to the wonderful nature of choke points, not to mention good firing positions and techno-heretically awesome weapons, we were able to kill them all before they managed to shoot or claw us. That's not to say that we actually killed all of the Tyranids. Nids don't tend to run out of bodies to throw at a problem, but we did convince them to rethink their strategy. Once the choke points were too, choked with their bodies to get any more past, the gaunts broke off to wait for heavier reinforcements. Now, we'd been in this sort of fight with Nids before. Back when we were actually in the Guard, we fought a memorable and debatably successful defensive battle against the bugs, so we knew what would almost certainly come next. Warriors, possibly with Ravener or Gargoyle support. On our respective sides of the hill, Amy, Nubby, and Tink all moved to elevated positions and helped Spot watch for the higher life forms. Meanwhile, those of us still on the ground made sure the mines in our next positions were ready. And Sarge checked in with Gravis and his scout. The Marines were still working on wearing down the zoanthrope shields without killing it, and asked us not to distract them again. We all made some rather unkind comments about the last part, but refrained from transmitting any of them. Spot the Wonder Drone tagged the second wave on its way in, and as we'd guessed, there were some warriors directing the charge from behind the initial meat shield. The Guard has a standard combat doctrine for pretty much every situation. While most of these are not very individual Guardsman friendly, the one for that sort of attack is a good one. So for once, we did things by the book. Admittedly, said book is rather short, but that just means it's easy to remember. The three of us that had moved into sniper positions held our fire and prepared to shoot the big one first.
On Doc and Tank's flank, an overcharged Tau laser thingy guided plasma bolt turned their warrior into chunky salsa. Over on Amy and Twitch's, a precision headshot from our actually quite talented markswoman took out theirs. With the synapse creatures dead, the Gauntlet lost cohesion, and both pairs of guardsmen easily mowed them down. Unfortunately, the sniper on our third flank was Nubby, who didn't have Tank's anti-armor weapon or Amy's accuracy. Very angry, if burnt and bloody, Tyranid warrior immediately returned fire with one of those big B-gun things, pinning Nubby down on his sniper perch. Sarge tried to hold off the incoming wave himself, using heavy use of his grenades and the choke point, but it quickly became apparent it wasn't going to work. Sarge calmed the rest of us, and over Nubby's shrill screaming, asked if anyone could give him support for he had to blow his mines and relocate. The rest of us were still rather busy with our mop-ups. Reinforcing Sarge meant crossing the zoanthrope-infested hilltop, so we all declined. It seemed like Sarge was going to have to give his flank safety margin. He was getting ready to blow his mines, and pulled Nubby out. When the scout marine told him to hold on just a little longer, Sarge managed it. He wound up having to use his boots and to keep a especially persistent gaunt off of him while he reloaded, and his armor and beefiness barely saved him for a few flesh borer hits, but he managed it. Right as things were getting downright dire, the warrior and several nearby gaunts went down to an amazing display of precision shooting. Nubby finally got his ass out of cover and helped Sarge turn the tide back as the scout returned to the zoanthrope fight. Things were looking pretty good, even if we could see the third wave mustering near the bottom of the hill. Good changed to great when we heard Gravis say the zoanthrope shield was almost down. And then everything went to shit.
Looking back, it's not that hard to spot the exact moment when the shifting of the everything occurred. Actually, it wasn't that hard to spot at the time either. Within 20 seconds of it happening, we knew what had gone wrong and why, but it took a bit longer for all the horrible results of that one screw-up to manifest. Anyway, what started that whole horrible, god-awful shit show was a simple communications failure at a rather hectic moment. The third wave of Tyranids was coming in, we were busy shooting them and getting ready to blow our mines and fall back. Up on top of the hill, Sergeant Gravis had the zoanthrope on the ropes and was ordering a scout to get ready to trank it. The scout marine had just returned from helping Sarge and was perched on one of the pointy pillars on top of the hill. As the scout got the trank ready and lined up what must have been a rather tricky shot, he spotted something and calmed us. His exact words were, "Interrogator, incoming Tyranid assault flyer, north side." Now let's do an experiment. First, go out and find 50,000 guardsmen. Actually, go out and get 100. It's not like guardsmen are hard to find. Hell, we're literally the largest organized fighting force in the galaxy, which kind of think it means the definition of standard response to anything is what we do, not what a few bloody crazy stomping on power armor getting eat by bugs. Anyway, ask any of those guardsmen what they will do when someone warns them hostile air units are incoming. Nothing else. No details or orders, just hostile air incoming. You know what they'll say? It'll be the same, regardless of regiment, specialization, rank, or anything. Every single one of them will tell you the same thing. They will get the hell into fucking cover. Apparently, the Emperor's Scythe chapter of the Space Marines aren't on the same page as the rest of us, though, or at least that Scout Marine wasn't.
I mean, if he'd just been a little more clear, if he'd added just a few more bloody words like take it out or cover me, or even if he just shortened it to incoming assault, we would have understood. But no, he told us there was a flyer incoming and stood there with his ass hanging out, wrongly believing that we'd shoot it down while he lined his shot on the zoanthrope. Nubby was the first one to notice the impending disaster. Well, actually, he just saw the scout standing there and told the Sarge that the stupid bastard's gonna get his ass shot off. Sarge stared for a second and then peeked out of cover and saw what sort of flyer was incoming. Everything started to click together. The incoming Tyranid wasn't some dedicated air bioform designed to strafe or bomb ground targets. It was the biggest, meanest melee monstrosity in the swarm, or at least the biggest one that was still capable of flight. It was a Flyrant, a winged hive tyrant, the Tyranid equivalent of a Lord General crossed with a main battle tank with some wings strapped on it for good measure. It was big, it was pissed, and it was coming right at the only member of our team that was standing out in the open. Unfortunately, Charge was just a little too late. By the time he started shouting his warning, nearly 5 tons of flying Tyranid hit the Scout Marine in the back. You know how in cartoons a bus or a train hits someone and they just sort of vanish? It was exactly like that, right down to how the poor bastard's sniper rifle was left pinwheeling in the air for a second. In the aftermath, 3 things became apparent. The Scout had not gotten his shot off. The physically exhausted Zoanthrope was doing a runner, and Gravis had bigger problems than chasing it. The Space Marine told us that the Zoanthrope was fleeing towards Sarge, asked us to catch it, and started shouting about some place called Sotha. A second later, the Tyrant let out a scream that shook the entire hilltop.
The situation was bad, but it was also, thank the Emperor, relatively simple. We had a perimeter to maintain, a hive tyrant to survive, and a Zoanthrope to catch. Sarge started belling out orders, and the rest of us scrambled to follow them. Since we had still all of our Marines in place, the perimeter was actually the least pressing issue. Sarge's first order was to fall back to the top of the hill and let the explosives hold off the smaller Tyranids for a while. Sarge then told us he was going after the Zoanthrope and sent Nubby to gather the scout's trank-loaded sniper rifle. For the rest of us, Sarge's final orders were a little bit more freeform. Tink was to get his drone on the Hive Tyrant, and the rest of us were told to handle it. Seriously, this was his entire master plan. By the Emperor! There's a bloody Hive Tyrant inside our perimeter. It's killed one Space Marine, and as soon as it fishes off the other, it'll kill us all. What should we do, sir?
Handle it.
He never managed to live that one down. The ridiculousness of that order aside, it's not like we actually needed one. Each of us knew that the only way we'd live through this was if the Tyrant was dead, forced to retreat, or kept distracted long enough for us to call on board the shuttle. All 3 of these possible solutions could be accomplished by the same way, by shooting the big bug and running away if it chased us. Some variations in improv could be thrown in as things progressed, but shoot and run was really the core strategy. Even the Space Marine was doing it, though more stab and run in his case.
The first of us to actually see the Hive Tyrant up close were Amy and Twitch. As they ran up towards the hilltop, Sergeant Gravis started coming down in these big graceful leaps made possible by his grav chute. Valiant heroes of the Imperium that both of them were, they immediately scrambled to find hiding places as the massive Tyranid charged down after Gravis. Both of them held their fire, not to mention their breaths, and observed what they could. The Flyrant was, of course, a winged bipedal bug that stood 6 meters tall and was made of distilled murder and hate. But it also had a few important distinguishing points. It had 4 arms, well, 3-ish after Gravis had gotten its attention. The top 1.5 ended in the usual Tyranid talons. The bottom pair held a massive bone sword and had one of those freaky sentient whip things. Each of those weapons were capable of messily killing any poor guardsman that got in close, but none of them had real range. That was a very good thing for us, but not so much for Gravis, though. Speaking of Sergeant Gravis, he was coming down the hill fast, but the Flyrant was gaining. He didn't have much room left to run before he hit Twitch and Amy's minefield. Right as it looked like he was going to try jumping over it and then wading through the incoming wave of nids, he suddenly reversed direction. All 3 of the Flyrant's attacks missed the Space Marine, as with more speed and agility than anyone running with the equivalent of a light tank should have, he dodged between the beast's legs. It was impressive as hell, especially the part where he got in a whack with his power sword on his way through. Both Amy and Twitch watched appreciatively until they realized the Flyrant wasn't going to be able to stop. The 4.9-ton Tyranid flailed its wings in a mad attempt to get airborne, completely failed to do so, and plowed through over a dozen AP mines. Twitch and Amy barely made it into new cover in time. Matt?
I have returned.
Read.
Of course, it takes more than a few AP mines to kill a Hive Tyrant. Aside from shredding its wings, all they really seemed to do was piss it the hell off. The Tyrant let out another of its piercing shrieks as it reversed direction and started pulling back up the hill after Gravis. Twitch and Amy watched it go, then realized they had a bit of a problem. Namely, that there was no longer much of a minefield between them and the wave of smaller Tyranids. The debate over what to do consisted of Amy and Twitch pointing in opposite directions, yelling, "Handle it!" at each other, then splitting up. Twitch ran around, dropping the last of his mines and spraying fire at the incoming gaunts. Amy sprinted up the hill after Gravis, and the Flyrant firing her pulse rifle at the massive target until it crested the hill and she lost line of sight. When Amy reached the top of the hill, she found Sergeant Gravis carefully circling around the enraged Flyrant while Doc and Tink shot it. Like the other two guardsmen, she sighted on the tower marker thingy Spot was projecting on the Tyranid and poured out as much fire as she could. It was beginning to look like the three of them were able to wear the creature down. Then Gravis botched one of his dodges. The Space Marine had to choose between trying to block the Flyrant's bone sword or dying a horrible death, and reluctantly chose the former. For the second time that day, he flew through the air with all the grace and aerodynamics of a thrown fucking brick. Sergeant Gravis ricocheted off of one of the stone spires encircling the hilltop, briefly tumbling upwards, then crashed into the dirt directly behind Doc and Tink. He was a tough bastard, though. Within a second of his landing, started moving again. Both the Space Marine and his armor groaned as he struggled to get back on his feet. The Flyrant let out yet another roar, sighted on the recovering Space Marine, and charged.
Alright, our reading order's out of whack now. Okay, you go next.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll read and then we'll start from the
back
top.
to normal order.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now in your normal commissariat approved uplifting story of heroism, this is where our two stalwart guardsmen would have stood their ground and laid down their lives to buy the wounded Space Marine time to recover. Then right after the guardsmen had finished valiantly sacrificing themselves, he would have magically gotten better and killed the vile Xenos. Oh, and then all the orcs and Tyranids on the planet would have died, and it would be the whole place had turned into a garden world that paid all of its tithes on time. There'd be statues of the heroic dead guardsmen everywhere. The Warp take those stories, and whoever keeps writing them, and the whole commissariat for that matter. Ever notice how it's always some guardsman and never the commissar who dies horribly in the Emperor's name? Anyways, Doc and Tink took one look at the charging Flyrant and ran for it. Okay, I realize that sounds bad, but it's not like they ran down the hill and left Gravis to die. They kept firing and ran perpendicularly along the top of the hill in, and I quote the official report here, an attempt to draw the Hive Tyrant's attention away from its target. Anyways, it's not like they would have accomplished anything by standing there, and there was no way either of them could have carried a fully armored Space Marine to safety. My point is what happened next was not Doc's, Tink's, or anyone else's fault, and I'll have you know that the Tribunal of Senior Ordos Xenos Inquisitors who reviewed Spot's footage agreed with that assessment. Well, 2/3 of the tribunal anyway. So while three of us poured a lot of plasma into the Flyrant, it closed to melee range with Sergeant Gravis. He parried the beast's whip thing, sidestepped a strike from its single ring talon, and did that trick where he dodged to its legs again. Whereupon the Flyrant turned, brought its bone sword around a mid-chest level, and cut Sergeant Gravis in half.
Twitch finished laying his replacement minefield and arrived on the hilltop right then, as did Sergeant Nubby, who were lugging the tranked zoanthrope between them. Their part of what could be generously called the plan hadn't involved anything as terrifying as the Flyrant, but it hadn't been a cakewalk either. Sarge managed to sight the fleeing zoanthrope as it came down the hill towards him. It turned out that even when too exhausted to keep itself hovering, the psyker bugs are capable of wriggling along the ground at a surprisingly high speed. While Nubby hunted down the scout's dropped rifle in his trank round, Sarge chased the zoanthrope back and forth between the rocks, dodging the occasional weak lightning bolt and stray flesh borer around as he did so. Eventually, he cornered the beastie between two spires, right as Nubby arrived with the comically oversized Astartes patterned sniper rifle. Since it quickly became apparent that Nubby was completely incapable of aiming the damn thing, and the zoanthrope was still squirming around a lot, Sarge decided to take the damn shot himself. The second he was distracted, the bug tried to escape again, and Sarge wound up tackling it and pinning it to the ground. It was like wrestling a cross between a greased pig, a giant snake, and an uninsulated power conduit. In the end, he collected a few scratches, a nasty bite wound, and a whole lot of electrical burns before Nubby just dragged the fucking rifle over and jammed it in the zoanthrope's underbelly. Then they hauled the surprisingly long and heavy Xenos up to the hilltop, pausing to chuck a few grenades at the incoming wave of Nid reinforcements on the way, and got there just in time to see Gravis's bisection. There was a brief silence, which was punctuated by two meaty thuds in Nubby's nasal voice. Holy shit. Think he's gonna be okay? Then the Flyrant roared again, and all six of us just had to open fire.
Spot was projecting its Tau laser thingy on the middle of the Flyrant's torso, and we all sighted our weapons on it and held the triggers down. Looking back, it's hard to say whether it was the sheer weight of fire, if the big bastard was just running out of energy, but its charge towards us was much slower than its earlier ones have been. Every single one of us got an entire magazine's worth of shots out before the Flyrant was a third of the way to Sarge and Nubby. It never made it to 2/3. There was sort of a squelchy pop, and its torso armor gave away, and the beast stumbled, sort of huddled there, trying to protect its wounded chest, and then sent out a screech that was echoed by smaller Tyranids climbing the hill. From the sound of it, they were finally getting past their minefields. They would be arriving in seconds. None of us went to hold off the incoming reinforcements, though. The flyer was the very definition of the big one. And we were going to shoot it first. Spot redirected its marker light to the Xenost's head. Not that we actually needed the fancy top flashlight, though. Even if the flyer's head was a relatively small target, it was a stationary one now. Every shot we fired hit. Within seconds, our mass plasma fire either punched through the Tyranid's head armor or cooked the thing's brain to the boiling point. Its head exploded like a particularly disgusting grenade, and a psychic pressure that none of us had even noticed was released. All around the hilltop, the incoming Tyranids broke and fled as quickly as they could, and the zoanthrope twitched a little where Sergeant Nubby had dropped it. Let me tell you, we'd escaped near certain death before, but the relief we all felt on the barren hilltop was the greatest in our lives. Every one of us just stood there and basked in the sheer joy of still being alive. Then Tink spoiled it by asking if Gravis had called the shuttle before he died.
Tink's question was followed by the sound of a few thousand orc wahs, and it occurs to us that we'd probably just killed the creature that had been holding the Tyranid defense of these hills together. I doubt anyone in the history of the Imperium has ever gone from ecstatic relief to blank panic as quickly as we did. Sarge started wildly flipping through the comm channels. Twitch ran around deploying blasts of explosives. Amy screamed at Tink for not remembering sooner, and Tink called Amy a skunk-haired super bitch. The odd men out were Doc, who had gone right past panic to depression, and Nubby, who defaulted to some very basic instincts when overwhelmed. While everyone else was busy screaming, shouting, mining, and crying, Nubby went to get himself a shiny, not quite new power sword. The cretinous little vulture found the sword still in Gravis's hand, which didn't deter him even slightly. He firmly planted a boot on the Marine's arm and started prying at the powered armored fist. As Nubby levered the smallest off of the Marine's fingers, two practically reflexive actions occurred. First, Gravis shook Nubby's grip off and tightened his fingers on his power sword. Second, Nubby automatically responded by drawing his combat knife and preparing to give the Emperor's peace, thereby settling any silly little ownership disputes. It was immensely lucky for all of us that Gravis' ceramite helmet was still sealed, since it made trying to slit his throat a long and noisy process. Doc noticed Nubby going at the Space Marine's armored neck like an incompetent lumberjack and realized what that implied, and body-checked Nubby off the not-quite-dead Sergeant Gravis. Our brilliant medic then stood there with his medkit open, panicking and trying to figure out how to treat the mother of all chest wounds.
The commotion caught Sarge's attention in turn, and he abandoned his fruitless attempts to contact the shuttle by randomly trying comm channels. Sarge's first question wasn't if Doc was sure Gravis was still alive or how that was even fucking possible, it was whether the Space Marine was capable of calling for evac. Doc gibbered and pointed out that Gravis's lungs had been cut clean in half, and he could actually see inside them. Sarge took that as a no, but noticed Nubby's knife stuck between Gravis's helmet and gorget. Without waiting for a medical opinion, he seized the knife and twisted it with all his beefy non-com strength. Later, it was explained to Sarge, but not Nubby, that the latches on Mark 7 power armor helmets don't actually lock. He could have just flipped them open. At the time, though, Sarge was too busy to waste time thinking and just tore apart several million thrones worth of data relays and void seals. When the helmet finally came off, with a tear and a snap rather than a little pop, Sarge ran over to where Amy was beating 7 kinds of shit out of Tink. He ended their friendly little argument over who the real bitch was by grabbing the back of Amy's orc-stained armor and unceremoniously chucking her in Twitch's direction. Sarge then dragged Tink to his feet, thrust Gravis' helmet onto the techie's hands, and screamed at him to make the Vox work. Tink stared at the helmet for a second, realized he had absolutely no fucking idea how anything in that thing worked, and wisely decided to try the most obvious thing first, which is to say, he put the helmet on his head and hesitantly asked if the thing was on. He was nearly deafened by the shuttle pilot screaming and requesting to know what the hell was going on and what had happened to Sergeant Gravis. Tink said that Sarge could answer that question, handed the helmet over with a smug little line about being able to fix anything, and went to see if Doc had anything for a broken nose. He very much, immediately, regretted that decision.
So, Sarge was wearing the helmet and explaining things to the shuttle pilot. Twitch was being Twitch, and since it looked like we wouldn't all be left stranded in the middle of an army of orcs, both Nubby and Amy decided it was fine to take a breather. They sat on the Trank zoanthrope, shared a pack of low sticks, and enjoyed the sight of Doc freaking the hell out and shaking Tink like a terrier with a rat.
Oh, God! Oh,
I don't know, fix him or something, stop shaking me!
oh, Tink! How do you fix being tired? This shouldn't even be alive! I don't know what's going on! I don't know how Space Marines work! What if touching a base stop working? What do I do?
Do the Space Marine thing.
What thing?
Harvest the gene seed.
Is what?
Gene seed. It's this like seed thing that Space Marines have. If you pull it out before a Marine dies, you can plant it in a observatory and he grows back from it. Yeah, they had this whole thing in the last season where Brother Captain Marcus, the cooperator, fell in battle, and the Fire Warrior rescue team had to.
Wait, you mean you fucking tell Vince you're basing this off of heretical cartoons?
They're not cartoons, they're not heretical, and do you have anything better?
Oh, shit. What is this gene seed? What does it look like, and where the fuck is it?
Oh, they had to censor the part where they cut it out, but I think it was like a second heart thing, and it was green and stuff.
Heart thing, like it's in his chest.
Yeah, right in the middle.
Okay, in the chest, the upper or the lower chest.
The
upper or lower chest. If I'm gonna be digging around inside of him, I at least need to know which fucking end of him to dig in.
I don't know. Why don't you go check out on the Scout?
Do I read this one? Then Jacob read the green text? What are we doing here?
Continuing this?
Yeah, I guess you guys are continuing this.
Here, we'll flip. The Scout Marine was pinned to the hilltop's ground a few dozen meters away from where he'd been perching when the Flyrant hit him. I'm using pinned quite literally here. He was face down with a Tyranid talon the size of a beefy telephone pole through his fucking back. The talon ended in a very neat cut that matched the stump the Flyrant had, which probably explained how Gravis had gotten his attention. Unlike Gravis, there wasn't much confusion over whether the Scout was dead. He started to go runny. It's not like all of him was melting, just the sort of expanding area around where he'd been speared. Said area, including both the upper and lower chest, though. In the name of medical science, Doc poked at the mushy corpse with a probe, then jumped backwards with a girly shout when it started to hiss and melt too.
Emperor, I swear he wasn't doing that earlier. Is this like a Space Marine thing? Do they melt when they die?
You don't think so? Wouldn't make it hard to reuse the armor? Bet you it's a Ned thing. Does your big book of pseudoscientific medical bullshit have a section on tyrant bioweapons?
Tyrant, bone sword, scything talon, toxic jacks!
Ah, neat. What's it say?
If in fully stocked field hospital, laboratorium, quarantine. Here! Battlefield instructions. Smear area with counterseptic, administer oral detox, scan and apply indicated toxin wands, give plasma, pray to the Emperor. I can do all of those!
Wait. Like plasma from a gun or a bag? And what about the gene seed, though?
Screw your gene seed. If we can keep him from melting until the shuttle arrives, we can ask the pilot. Now take these and go to his bottom half.
These are pills, Doc. How do I give a pair of legs pills?
How do you think?
Oh, God. Oh, no, I'm not qualified for this.
Well, neither am I. Now do it!
Doc's panic medical treatments were of rather dubious usefulness, especially the part where he fed a detox tab to the nearly dead Space Marine. That stuff is nearly enough to kill you on its own, and it made the big guy flail around and spurt some nasty stuff out the end of his torso. At least it proved that he was still alive, stop being the whole not really breathing thing. Also, Doc put more fluid back in and sealed off most of the leaky exposed torso area, so it's probably a net gain for Gravis. We all watched him running around and yelling at Tink, who was stuck with the literal ass end of the job, while the sound of the oncoming orcs grew steadily louder. It came as immense relief when the shuttle was dropped out of the clouds. And you better believe that we were lined up and ready to board before it hit the ground. The pilot wasn't exactly on the same page as the rest of us, though. He didn't stay in his seat and keep the engine spun up. Instead, he was standing at the rear hatch when it opened. None of us had actually seen the pilot on our flight in, and that first meeting was rather unpleasant. He was a Scout Marine and looked nearly identical to the other guy, except for not being impaled and dissolving. He was also considerably worse the whole stoicism thing. The pilot stood in our way and demanded to know what had happened to Sergeant Gravis and Rubrum, which was a sort of awkward since none of us had actually bothered to learn the dead Scout Marine's name. Anyway, the pilot did not take the Sergeant's bisection well and nearly went berserk when he saw his buddy's rifle sticking out of Nubby's pack. The outermost minds were going off at this point. None of us wanted to die on the landing pad. So Sarge acted rather cruelly. He yanked the Legiamen Beliefful salvage out of Nubby's pack, thrust it in the pilot's arms, and said the Scout wanted him to have it, and then pointed out that his boss was going to die if we don't take off right now.
We didn't have any problem securing the zoanthrope for takeoff. The snaky Xenos was still completely out of it and fit right into one of the oversized seats. Gravis was a bit of a problem, though. Doc wound up strapping him upside down in one of the seats, supposedly because it let him tighten the crash harness and would keep everything from falling out if the bandage gave way. None of us knew enough to argue, so we went with the same gross end-up theory for his lower half, which was put in the seat next to him. During the strapping in process, Gravis' sword, bolter, and other little weapons and gadgets disappeared into Nubby's backpack. Thankfully, the pilot was too busy taking off and dodging small arms fire from the incoming orcs to see a single fucking thing of this. After we were out of the orcs' range, our ascent out of the atmosphere went comfortably enough. Sarge sat in the relative peacefulness and inspected us troops. In addition to his ample supply of lacerations and electrical burns, we'd collected a concussion, a fairly nasty leg wound, a broken nose, some cracked ribs, nearly a dozen minor flesh borer hits, and an orc juice marinade. We were all still alive, though, and we had Oak's zoanthrope too, so all in all, we called it a damn win. Sure, our Space Marines had taken one hell of a beating, but we'd completed our objective, and horrible sacrifices in the name of victory are what Space Marines are all about. I mean, we'd been attacked by a bloody hive tyrant, and 2 Marines for a tyrant is a pretty good trade. Anyways, beginning to look like Gravis might just survive long enough to get into a real Medicaid. So yeah, only a win. We were in the middle of congratulating ourselves and speculating on if Gravis would be put in a dreadnought when 3 things happened. First, the zoanthrope started twitching. Then, Gravis' armor started beeping, and his lower half began to smoke. And finally, the helmet in Sarge's lap started talking.
His cock is smoking.
Damn.
So no shit, there we were, sneaking across a war zone with a slowly awakening Tyranid Psyker and a quickly dying Space Marine, when Sergeant Rebus called for his evac. If you actually needed proof that the entire purpose of the universe is to shit on poor hardworking Guardsmen, it'd be damn hard to find something better than the timing right here. I mean, just to remind you, this wasn't some simple pickup from a combat zone he needed. No. He needed us to sneak back into the boarding range of a Tyranid hive ship, which was still being assaulted by a few million orc fighters, to pick him up before the high-yield vortex bomb he just planted went off. You could say that we weren't the ones doing the actual sneaking, that we'd been safely through it before without the armed vortex bomb, of course, but this time it would be a race against a zoanthrope waking up and Sergeant Gravis melting. Every man has their limit, and this is well beyond ours. Before the pilot could respond, Sarge put on Gravis' helmet and clearly told the Space Marine to wait his damn turn. All of us, except for Doc, who was rather busy, cheered. Sergeant Rebus and the pilot were less enthusiastic. The argument that followed included accusations of cowardice, the pilot coming out of the cockpit with a bolter and threatening to either kill us or the zoanthrope, and Sarge telling one of the Emperor's Angels of Death to shut up and soldier. In the end, a combination of devotion to the mission and desire to save his sergeant won the pilot to our side. Sergeant Rebus was instructed to delay the bomb's detonation and hold out until we were dropped off and a return trip could be made. The conversation ended with Rebus bitterly complaining that dying waiting for the evac was an end worthy of a guardsman. Sarge responded by telling him that holding the line wasn't that hard. After all, us guardsmen did it all the time.
Now it might sound that we callously doomed a team of valiant Space Marines to their deaths, but we really weren't delaying their extraction that long. The Marines had prepared for this type of situation when they'd adjusted their mission plan to account for only having one shuttle. The occurrence border had followed our stealthy little vessel into the system as quietly as it could, and now that it was close enough that it would be a matter of minutes, not hours to reach it, of course, being that close meant there was a significant risk of detection, and the occurrence border didn't have any real way to hold off and attack by the orcs of the Nids. Back at the briefing, Rebus had claimed it was acceptable risk, though, which goes to show you what a bloody tactical genius he was. Okay, maybe that's a little unfair. Having the ship closer turned out to be very good for him. It's not like he could have foreseen that we can't capture the zoanthrope, but forget to bring about the second dose of that special psych tranquilizer stuff. Though if he spared the blame, then that means that Gravis and his scout deserve a little for not taking the excessively simple precaution of leaving a few spare doses in the shuttle. I mean, we were going into extremely hostile territory. Why was that scout carrying all the tranks? And why hadn't either of them told us a second dose would be needed? Is Tyranid wrangling some super secret Emperor sides-only technique? Or did they think that there was no way to survive and continue the mission if they didn't? Well, actually, that one is completely understandable. Arrogant as all hell, but understandable. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Zoanthrope was a problem later. At the time, our big concern was that half of Gravis was dying and the other half was violently decomposing.
Once again, the task was divided between Doc and Tink. This time, Doc was much calmer. His response was surprisingly reasonable and professional. He fussed around the upside-down Space Marine torso with his medical scanner and tox wand, and shouted questions about Astartes' biology and power armor automated Medicae systems to the pilot. There was some rather confusing talk about illicit kidneys, biomedical cogitators, and cellular regenerator reservoirs, which the rest of us fucking ignored because Tink's part of the job was a complete shit show. Whatever was on the Flyer and Sword, when it got going, it really got going. Ravis's lower half went from fine to melting from the wound down in mere seconds. It's hard to say whether Tink's response was the best or the worst one available, but it was certainly the most disgusting. In an effort to slow down the process, he unbuckled the power-armored legs and flipped them upside down. The smoldering bandage immediately gave way and dumped a horrible combination of meat juice, xenos toxins, and extremely powerful acid onto the seat. The smell was beyond vile, and all of us had to put on our rebreathers just to stay conscious, which was lucky considering how many airborne toxins were found in that shuttle when we landed. So after the spillage started dissolving the seat, the rest of us became very interested in helping Tink. Of course, none of us knew jack about biochemistry, so we were only able to offer what might be called mechanical solutions to the acid problem. Most of those suggestions were absolutely terrible. In the end, we settled on the traditional occurrence border technique of shoving it out the airlock and hoping it needed oxygen and heat to keep doing whatever it was doing. That's why, when we finally docked at the occurrence border, our shuttle's hull was decorated by a pair of legs being gripped by Spot the Wonder Drone. It says something that none of the people waiting in the bay even decided to comment on it a single time. Take it away.
The occurrence border had been warned of the time-sensitive nature of our cargo, and the welcoming party was well prepared. Doc's hospitaller girlfriend and her minions were ready with a bunch of scary-looking medical gear and a sort of big goo-filled container. Gravis' legs and, to Tink's horror, Spot were immediately pried off the hole, cramped into the giant pickle jar, and hauled off before we even made it out of the shuttle. What did I miss, by the way? I was doing something.
No, okay, so they were in the ship going back, and have you ever accidentally had
Shit
the
yourself?
top of a ketchup bottle just pop off while you're trying to pour?
Who pours ketchup?
Not pour ketchup, but like squirt the ketchup out of the bottle, and it
Yeah.
just pops off.
Yeah.
Well, that happened to the Space Marine's legs,
Yummy.
and it got all over the seat, and it was a biohazard and awful and terrible. And
I like the dog picture going, wah, wah, wah.
that's
That's what Bo does. Oliver tries to catch the water from the sprinkler, and Bo just fucking eats it.
That's really funny.
Doc was the first one down the ramp. With Tink's help, he deposited Gravis on a waiting gurney, then turned to his girlfriend and went for a hug and a quick kiss. He didn't get either, and so she screamed at him to keep his rebreather on, hosed him with a chemical sprayer, and then ordered him to go through a full decontamination and meet her in the med bay. Doc stood there and dripped for a second, and dejectedly jogged after his departing girlfriend. Those of us who weren't struggling to get the zoanthrope out of the shuttle chuckled at this, at least until a pair of sprayer-armed minions started hosing us as well. We'd all been thoroughly soaked by the time we got the zoanthrope out of its seat and loaded into the cargo trolley Hannah had waiting for us. The sprayers then moved on hosing the shuttle's interior, but before they could get much done, the rear hatch slammed shut and the engines kicked back on. In clear violation of all safety procedures, the pilot rocketed out of the bay before we cleared the area. As he left, the pilot calmed us and promised vengeance if Gravis didn't survive. And from the helmet Sarge was still carrying, we overheard him giving his ETA to Sergeant Rebus. We silently wished him luck, and then turned to the serious business of getting our zoanthrope stored in the psyker containment cells.
The zoanthrope hadn't been any trouble during the unloading process. That's because it had come almost fully awake while we were still 10 minutes out, and we had to do something about it. Initially, we'd hoped that this far away from the Tyranid and the hive ship, it'd revert to being a dumb beast. Acting on this theory, when the zoanthrope started clawing at its straps and manifesting small bolts of electricity, Sarge attempted to establish superiority by punching it in the snout. That did not work. This just makes me think of the Tyranids as like sharks, and you can just like pat their nose and just flip them around when they're not near the hive ship. Plan B was to hit it with one of the guard-issue trank and painkiller syrettes from Doc's kit. It's not like he was using them anyway. When that didn't work, we went with Plan C, which was to keep applying Plans A and B until they did work. After a fair amount of punching and enough tranks to kill 3 men, the uppity Xenopsyker finally went back to sleep. Disturbingly, though, the shuttle was still filled with little snaps of static, and we all felt a sort of ominous pressure in the air. We tried to call the xenologist adept back on the ship to get his opinions on that, but our comms had a surprising amount of trouble, so we settled on asking him to meet us in the bay. The adept was waiting next to Hannah, and we loaded the zoanthrope onto the pellet. He took note of the minor phenomena, as well as the empty syrettes that we'd left sticking in the Xenos. After processing this for a second, he began yelling at us to go faster, which was immensely unhelpful, since we were all outrunning him until he got the pellet himself. The part where he called ahead to warn the psyker cells and asked Fumbles to meet us halfway was more useful, though, so we forgave him.
Picture, if you will, a cargo pallet racing down the corridors of a spaceship. It is occupied by a large, unconscious Xenos that looks like a cross between a snake and a fetus. A slightly overweight man in robes and a guardsman with an injured leg. The guardsman is holding a wrench that is connected to a random tangle of wires, which has been hung over the Xenos. As the pallet races along, he's using the wrench to ground increasingly larger bursts of inexplicably green electricity against the floor and walls. Behind the pallet are a terrified bunch of tech priests, and a burly guardsman who looks like he'd recently crawled through a burning razor blade factory. And both of them are pushing the pallet as fast as they can through the maze-like series of corridors that make up the ship. Every twist and turn requires a frantic effort to change the heavy pallet's direction, and occasionally one of the pushers will misjudge, slam into a wall or doorframe, and then have to scramble to catch back up. A fair distance ahead of the pallet are two guardsmen. One is wiry and wreathed with explosives, the other is short and lugging a backpack packed near to bursting. They're screaming at people to get out of the corridors, applying indiscriminate force when necessary, and opening the various doors and hatches the pallet needs to go through. A little bit behind them is a guard's woman who could be defined as regal-looking if she wasn't completely filth-encrusted. She's pausing at corners and relaying upcoming direction changes to the pallet's pushers. So this parade of panic made its way through nearly half a kilometer of ship corridors, trailing confusion and technical failures behind it, but didn't really get bad until right at the halfway point, when Fumbles suddenly, godlessly stepped out of a side hatch into the path of the onrushing pallet. A second later, he was face down on top of the zoanthrope, clutching his badly bruised shins and screaming with all the force he had at the top of his lungs.
Not being a psyker, I can't really say what Fumbles did during that mad scramble. From our perspective, he sort of just laid there and gibbered, and later on claimed not to remember any of it. He was probably doing something really important, like keeping the zoanthrope from doing stuff while it was unconscious or hiding us from the hive mind. Chances are that without him doing his thing, we would have died horribly before we got to the holding cells. We didn't really appreciate that at the time, though. All we noticed was how immensely inconvenient Fumbles made the rest of our journey. After Fumbles arrived, in addition to the electricity thrown off by the sleeping zoanthrope, I can't read right now, sorry, we had to deal with freak indoor snowstorms, a few instances of spontaneous gravity reversal, and all sorts of creepy noises and visions. On 2 occasions, the effects were so bad, the Sarge considered dumping the accident-prone psyker off the pallet and leaving him behind, but the xenologist adept insisted that he stay. Luckily, Hannah's augmetics didn't take that long to start working again after they spontaneously locked up, and the minor demon only made 3 steps in before a combination of pulse fire and what might have been called a power wrench turned it into chunky salsa. Despite all the complications, we made incredibly good time on our mad sprint, covering something like a kilometer in just under 6 minutes. That wasn't quite fast enough, though. We'd reached the final stretch and could see Jim holding the door open, and then an ominous sort of psychic pressure we'd been feeling suddenly ratcheted up. As the pressure mounted, Fumbles gibbered something like, "It sees, it knows, it hungers," and then the entire corridor filled with a torrential downpour of blood. Everything slowed to a crawl as the first drop of blood hit Sarge's face. Memories of 2 psychers in a cargo bay fitted through his mind, and he slowly began to reach towards Fumbles. Then, everything exploded. Sergio?
There were actually 2 explosions. The first was a sort of psychic concussion. The rain of blood paused in midair. Then there was a crack of energy and a wave of force radiated outwards from Fumbles. It was strongest at its epicenter. All 3 of the pallet's human passengers were thrown off. Tink and the Adepo slammed into the corridor's walls, while Fumbles flew upward, inexplicably stuck to the ceiling for a second, then flopped to the floor with an unpleasant splash. Behind the pallet, Sarge saw the wave coming and rather gallantly pushed Hannah behind him. This did not have the intended result. The wave hit Sarge, and over 100 kilos of cyclically propelled non-com slammed into Hannah. This in turn results in the both of them tumbling backwards, landing into a heap. Unfortunately, with Sarge on the top nearly crushing the poor cog girl, he probably would have died of embarrassment if it weren't for the fact that all 5 human projectiles were left unconscious by the blast. The final effect of the second concussion was to blow out all the lights in the corridor. Twitch, Nubby, and Amy activated their shoulder-mounted lights and watched through the rain of blood as the pallet sloshed to a halt. The 3 of them held position and kept their weapons trained on the zoanthrope until Jim shouted Hannah's name and began to run past them. Nubby casually stuck out a foot and tripped the panicked Cogboy, then followed Amy and Twitch as they began to move towards the pallet. Their cautious advance nearly reached the pallet when the zoanthrope suddenly jerked into the air. It hung there for a second, like some sort of horrible giant puppet being held up by tangled strings. The second explosion shook up the entire ship, the whole world went green, and Amy started screaming.
It was a bit of a surprise to find ourselves alive after that. Nubby and Twitch stood there in the ankle-deep blood, shielding their eyes against the bright green light and watching Amy, who was screaming and wildly firing her pulse rifle with the zoanthrope's glowing energy shield. Guardsmen that they were, both of them quickly raised their own weapons and started firing as well. And after a few seconds, they noticed that something was quite weird. The zoanthrope was not fighting back. There were no lightning bolts or soul-rending screeches, and on closer inspection, it didn't even appear to be awake. Of course, it wasn't until Theo came out of where he'd been hiding in the cells, helped Jim to his feet, and asked whether the plan was still to capture the zoanthrope alive that they considered not shooting the Xenos. Everyone except Amy, who was too busy hysterically shooting at the zoanthrope to talk, put their heads together to figure out what to do. While the zoanthrope may not have been attacking, the psychic pressure had gone from ominous to outright painful, so the debate was a very short one. The second a halfway reasonable suggestion was put forward, they all leapt into action, though Twitch and Nubby both bitterly complained that it was the non-human who made the plan. Well, plan is a very grandiose term. They wanted to get the zoanthrope into the cells, but no one wanted to touch the sparking green shield, so Theo had made the stereotypically Tau suggestion of using drones. He and Jim had sent a small swarm of servo skulls and clutched together Tau drones behind the zoanthrope and had them start ramming its shield in an attempt to hurt it towards the door. Nubby and Twitch contributed by getting Amy to stop shooting it and making sure no one was drowning in the warp blood.
The plan was decent, but had a major problem. It was too slow. The skulls and drones didn't have that much pushing power to begin with, and the electrical nature of the zoanthrope's shield was frying them one by one. It was a race against the psychic pressure mounting to lethal levels, and we were losing. None of us had any other ideas, though, and things probably would have gone poorly if Amy hadn't finally snapped out of her PTSD-inspired violent freakout. When Amy returned to coherence, she took one look at how slow the pallet was going, cussed everyone out for being useless sissies, and seized the forgotten pallet. She ran towards the zoanthrope, building up as much speed as the blood allowed, and the last second levered the pallet on its two wheels and used it as a sort of poorly balanced battering ram. It worked surprisingly well. With Nubby and Twitch's help, another 2 blows got the zoanthrope to the door of the psychic containment cells, where the problem of how to fit a 3-meter energy bubble through a 2-meter wide door presented itself. This was solved by the arrival of Sergeant Tink, who finally finished up their naps and decided it was time to actually be useful. While Jim and Theo, who weren't quite as stubborn as us guardsmen, argued about whether it was possible to widen the door without damaging something or other, we backed to the end of the corridor. We picked the pallet up like a more traditional battering ram, Sarge positioned himself at the end, and then we charged. Jim and Theo's debate was brought to a halt as a widely sparking Xenos psyker shot between them bounced off a few pieces of delicate machinery and neatly slid into the waiting stasis unit. The techie slapped various on buttons, and the terrible psychic pressure vanished. Out of the corridor, those of us who hadn't broken anything in the charge cheered, but our enthusiasm dwindled as every comm terminal in the cells began ringing.
Jim checked the caller ID on one of the terminals and saw it was the captain, and decided that this was our problem. Well, he said it was our problem, but everyone knew it was really Sarge's. Chain of command goes both ways, and all that, so we hauled our too exhausted to be fearless leader off the ground, relocated his shoulder, and pushed him towards the nearest comm terminal. He stared at the thing reproachfully for a few seconds, swore a bit to make himself feel better, then finally bit the bullet and grabbed the handset. All of us listened in as Sarge answered the call, both because we were curious and because the captain was yelling so loud that it was impossible for us not to. The man in charge of flying us through the void, who sounded both furious and terrified, had a few questions for us. Specifically, what in the Emperor's name had we done, why his navigator was hysterical, and why his astropath was dead, and why 2 hive ships were headed towards us. Let me tell you, nothing ruins the taste of victory quite thoroughly as hearing about how much collateral damage there was. Anyway, Sarge dealt with the captain by holding out the handset at arm's length and waiting for the man to run out of breath. When his chance came, Sarge told the captain we had the cargo secure, then promised to come up to the bridge. While he did that, the rest of us wearily speculated on how screwed we were and collected our teammates from the blood-filled corridor.
Fumbles was alive, but completely out of it, and there was something off about his eyes, aside from being all rolled back and fucky looking. It was quickly decided that he needed a trip to the medbay, as did Hannah and the Adept. Despite being in better shape than Fumbles, both of them were obviously in a pretty fair amount of pain from their various dents and bruises. The less callous members of the squad felt a little bit guilty about that, Sometimes it's easy to forget that even the weediest guardsman is a great deal tougher than most folks. So as I said, Sarge finished his call with a promise to come up to the bridge, which led to a near mutiny from the rest of us. It said something about our level of exhaustion. We found the prospect of yet another damned hike more distressing than the incoming hive ships. Since he was far too tired himself to force us all to come with him, and because there was some other stuff that needed doing anyway, everyone but Amy, who turned out to be terrible at rock, paper, scissors, was excused from that trek. Nubby and Twitch were tasked with taking Fumbles, the Adept, and Hannah to the medbay on the massively dented cargo pallet. Tink wanted to join the medbay group both to get patched up and to retrieve Spot, but Jim and Fio needed his help with something technical sounding, so he had to stay. Hannah wound up promising to save his drone from whatever horrible medical things were being done to it, and send it down with whoever was going to clean up the giant warp blood puddle.
Sarge and Amy arrived on the bridge, where they were surprised to discover that they were not the only ones covered in blood. The communications officer's front side had a nice coating of red, with a few white and gray chunks mixed in. It turned out that when the captain said the astropath was dead, he meant really, really, really dead. Anyways, the captain was up on his podium doing captainy things. When he saw Sarge and Amy, he paused from yelling at people and spared all of 10 seconds to tell Sarge that there was now 3 hive ships incoming. He had absolutely no intention of letting them get into firing range, and we'd be leaving just as soon as the warp drive finished warming up. After that, Sarge would explain just what us dirt suckers had done to the ship. As the captain went back to yelling at subordinates, Sarge digested the new information. After a few seconds, Amy realized he was stuck and performed the single duty she'd been brought along for, which was to say she jabbed Sarge in the ribs and reminded him to ask about the Space Marines. While Sarge stepped up to the podium with the captain, Amy, her important work completed, commandeered a comfy-looking chair from a terrified ensign. She fended off all attempts to remove her with a combination of obscenity, death threats, and some totally justified violence. The discussion on the podium quickly became an argument, albeit a quiet one. Sarge was not happy to hear that the Space Marines were not aboard, or that the captain had no intention of waiting for them. The captain was not happy with Sarge's complete lack of understanding when it came to the realities of naval warfare. Sarge made nearly a dozen suggestions with how time could be bought. The captain, using the same sort of condescending tone we use when talking about basic squad tactics to adepts and such, explained why every single one was either unwise, idiotic, or downright impossible.
In the end, Sarge was forced to accept that unless the Space Marines made it back on their own, or at least started answering their Vox, they were going to be left behind. He dejectedly left the captain to his business and wandered over to the brain splatter communications officer. Out of a morbid sense of duty and the fact that all of his information had already been broadcast to Space Marines, Sarge had the officer direct the Vox array towards the hive ship that Rebus had boarded, and then began explaining the situation. The rather bleak message got no response, which indicated that Marines were still too close to the hive ship to break Vox silence, or as Amy unhelpfully suggested, that they were already dead. After a few minutes, Sarge's transmissions dissolved into awkward apologies for abandoning the Space Marines to their deaths. Eventually, it grew so pathetic that Amy forced Sarge to hang up the box and stop embarrassing himself. A second ensign was evicted from his chair, and both of them sat and watched the bridge's tactical display and the countdown to warp slowly continued. It was an incredibly depressing scene, but Sarge felt he needed to stay till the end, and Amy was similarly bound to keep Sarge company. Sarge moped. Amy flicked pieces of orc at the 2 tech priests off the bridge. Then the captained, and the rest of the bridge officers ran around doing stuff like redirecting the void shields. Then at warp minus 60, everyone flinched as the psychic equivalent of millions of nails running down a massive chalkboard swept over them. Luckily, the bridge's windows had already been covered in preparation for entering the warp, so no one was driven insane by the sight of a massive hole in reality forming and sucking an entire hive ship, not to mention a few thousand orc fighters, into the warp. In the confusion of prayers and the curses that followed, Sarge noticed the Vox station chiming.
Sarge nearly strangled the communications officers. He yanked the praying man up off the floor and back into his damn seat. After a few seconds of button pressing from the officer and unhelpful yelling from Sarge, the Vox station spat out a piece of paper. Sarge snatched the paper and scanned the 3 lines of text on it. The only one that made sense was, "Do not let us be forgotten, Sergeant Rebus." But that was enough for Sarge. He ran to the captain and thrust the paper into his hands. Sarge was halfway through triumphantly telling the captain the Marines were alive, probably just needed a small amount of time to dock, and the captain shrugged, handed the paper back. Amy had restrained Sarge as the captain told all hands to brace and began the final countdown to warp. 10 seconds later, the most violent warp transit either Sarge or Amy had ever experienced knocked them both to the ground. Over in the medbay, Twitch and Nubby had to hold Fumbles down as he suffered a massive seizure, and Doc had to pour Fortune to vomit while wearing a surgical mask. Had the poor Fortune. Down in the Psyker holding cells, Tink was knocked on his ass as a few overstressed pieces of equipment underwent rapid, unplanned disassembly. As Jim hauled him back up, Theo poked his head out and asked if that had been the warp jump. Because the psychic pressure of the hive mind wasn't decreasing. The ensuing argument over whether Theo actually knew how to read the exterior psychic activity display was interrupted by a bolt of green fucking lightning.
Back on the bridge, the captain explained that the first 2 lines of the Space Marine's message had consisted of an astropathic contact code and orbital vector. The code was probably to reach some Emperor-sized battle barge, and with the vector they'd been able to jump in and pick up their stranded battle brothers. It'd probably take a few months, but Marines are supposed to be very patient about that sort of thing. Sarge accepted this without argument, mostly because he was too tired to get back up. Unfortunately, Sarge wasn't allowed to just go to sleep on the floor of the bridge. It wasn't that the captain or any of the other bridge officers objected. After the explanation, he became preoccupied with some unexpected hive ship-shaped blips on the scanners, and said the problem was a very annoying voice in his comm bead. Tink, who was talking with the speed of someone that had just been dosed on stim, had a few questions about what the hell is going on. Sarge was forced to get off the comfortable floor and explain that the big spike of warp energy had been the vortex bomb. No one had known the jump would be that bad, and the hive mind's continued presence had probably something to do with the remains of the vortex hive ship floating next to us in the warp. There was a bit of chatter in the background that sounded like "told you so," but Tink was too hyped up to actually listen to the answers. Halfway through Sarge's explanation, Tink started a high-speed tirade about how delicate and complex every piece of equipment in the cells was, how much of that equipment had been damaged during the Zoanthrop's imprisonment, and how important it was to be told about things before they happened. Tink's irate rambling was finally brought to a halt by the sound of a lightning bolt and some incredibly girly screaming in the background, followed by Jim ripping the comm bead off of Tink's head and screaming, "The Zoanthrop is awake!" into it.
According to Amy, Sarge didn't start crying when he realized the mission wasn't over yet, but it was a close thing. His despair didn't last long enough. Within a few seconds, he was barking a sit rep out of Tink and had Amy relaying orders to the rest of us. In summary, the stasis unit was on the fritz. The warp presence, shroud, and exterior psi shielding were being steadily torn apart by the hive mind's continued assault. The psi suppressor was currently on fire, and the Zoanthrop was awake. The end result was the captive Xenos was shooting half-strength lightning bolts every time the stasis field flickered, and everything was seconds away from spontaneously exploding. The situation was bad, but not quite as bad as Jim had made it sound. Dick had made sure that he could fix everything. All he needed was old Bill, Hannah, and every available tech priest, a whole lot of parts, and some idiots to stand in front of the lightning bolts, to be sent down to the Psyker holding cells. Also Doc, or someone better at medicine than Doc, because Tink couldn't feel his leg anymore, and Jim's fleshy bits were a bit crispy. Oh, and recaf. Lots and lots of recaf. It took a lot of yelling and a bit of theft, not to mention at least 2 outright abductions to put the relief force together, but we managed it. What followed was an absolutely heroic repair effort by the techies, plus a fair bit of general assistance from the rest of us, which is to say that in addition to playing Gopher, we took turns holding a grounded boarding shield in front of the Zoanthrop, and shooting the small demonic forms that occasionally rose out of the blood pool in the hallway. Finally, after several hours of frantic labor, and what we were later informed was a similarly frantic retreat from the mangled, but still living remains of the hive ship, the occurrence border dropped back out of the warp, and the situation in the cells stabilized. We declared victory, and went the fuck to sleep.
Now, I say we declared victory, but that was more in the tactical sense than the strategic. We'd reached a sort of temporary calm spot, but all of us knew it was not going to last. We captured the Zoanthrop and repaired its prison to a sort of minimally functional level. We still had to haul it across an entire segmentum. That meant months of warp travel, which, given the notorious unworthiness of our ship, was quite dangerous enough without the imprisoned Xenos Psyker. None of us were optimistic enough to think that we'd make it through the whole thing without incident, and I won't go into what the more pessimistic members of the squad predicted. Once we'd all gotten some very much needed sleep and medical treatment, a long and incredibly tedious post-mission meeting was held. All of us attended, and after the initial part where we regaled everyone with our heroic exploits, people started finding excuses to leave. These ranged from legitimate concerns about projects and patience to Nubby's dubious mumbling about having left his felid in the oven, to Amy just walking out, but eventually everyone but Sarge and Jim escaped. In the end, it was just them, the captain, the adepts, and a few of the ship's officers planning out the whole mad voyage, while the rest of us slouched around the medbay. Our continuous presence in the medbay wasn't really appreciated. The hospitality didn't really mind us, but her minions made several pointed comments about how nice it would be if some of us, specifically Nubby and Twitch, went back to our own damn quarters. We ignored them, though. It's not like we didn't appreciate our quarters. We just wanted to stick together, and both Doc and Fumbles were more or less stuck in the medbay.
Luckily, Doc wasn't stuck in the medbay because he'd been badly hurt. His girlfriend might have done horrible medical things to us if he'd been nearly crippled again. In fact, Doc was doing better than the rest of us were, primarily because he'd missed out on that shit show in the cells. Sergeant Gravis was in pretty bad shape, though, and most of Doc's time was taken up with his treatment. While the bisected Space Marine's condition had improved slightly when he'd been moved to the much better stocked and staffed medbay, that had only been temporary. There was some sort of complex chemical war going on between the Tyranid toxins and Gravis' weird Space Marine biology. Doc's girlfriend had hooked up a medical cogitator to some sort of socket in Gravis' power armor. Doc was constantly either injecting or extracting fluids from the comatose Astartes, based on what it said. It was remarkably unpleasant to watch, and the rest of us found it amazing how persistent Doc was about the whole thing. Honestly, the rest of us, including the Hospitaller, mind you, were in favor of just letting the Space Marine die after the second day of her horrible medical torture. But Doc seemed committed to keeping Gravis alive as long as it was possible. We left him to it, both because it was far too gross to keep watching and because Fumbles needed our company more than Doc. Fumbles was in the medbay for what you might call personal reasons. He'd come out of the psychic battle with the zoanthrope or hive mind or whatever. Different. Mentally, he was okay. I mean, he was still a bit neurotic and starved for praise as ever, but he still uncontrollably broadcast his emotions to everyone nearby. But aside from that and not remembering anything from the light, he was fine. The problem was his eyes. At first, they just looked odd, and he was mostly blind. But over the few days we rested in normal space, they sort of grew and changed.
Now, none of us wanted to use the M word, even if he was a psyker to begin with. That's sort of the stuff you're supposed to tell the commissar about. I mean, his eyes got to the size of a bloody fist. Well, maybe not Sarge's fist, but definitely as big as one of Doc's girly hands. Anyways, that wasn't all. His pupils got all weird, too, and at their smallest, they were about as wide around as your finger. Plus, they sort of shined a bit, and they didn't always stay circular. It was creepy as all hell, let me tell you. Especially because his eyelids didn't grow, so he couldn't properly close his eyes. Creepiness aside, though, the eye thing was amazingly unpleasant for Fumbles. Well, for one thing, they didn't fit in his head properly, and there were all sort of painful pressure building up. Then there were how sensitive they were. Anything but the dimmest light blinded the poor guy, and he couldn't even see that well in the dark, since the skull pressure kept him from focusing. He wound up hiding away in one of the private treatment rooms with all the lights off and the window shut, radiating misery. It was all we could do to take turns trying to make him feel better, and matters were not helped by the way the Hospitaller initially reacted to the situation. I mean, Doc's girlfriend didn't go all purge the unclean, but after it became obvious what sort of shit was going on, she began studiously ignoring Fumbles. This was especially rough on the little guy, being a telepath and all. Luckily, Doc stepped in, and he got some help from our old diplomat adept, too. They sat down with her, and after a few hours, she came into Fumbles' room, muttering to herself about it being just another wound suffered in the Emperor's service. Nubby and Twitch were initially distrustful of the change of heart, but she let the more hygienic of the pair stay to observe, and some medically approved skull cracking and eyelid stretching later, Fumbles was feeling much better.
He's got anime eyes now.
Yes, he does in fact have anime eyes now. Or giant fucking... It reminds me of your character in Alex's campaign, Jacob, in a way.
Thank you. That's what I was thinking, honestly. The fucking picture I keep using.
Anyway, we all hung out in the medbay while Sarge had his incredibly long meeting and had a quiet sort of post-mission celebration. This primarily consisted of hanging out in Fumble's darkened room, a little drinking, and the sort of idle bullshitting that all guardsmen revel in. Twitch sat next to Fumbles and gave him a blow-by-blow of our mission, with a lot of commentary about what was really going on added in. Fumbles mostly just nodded and played with the pair of welding goggles Nubby had acquired for him from somewhere. They were going to need some resizing before he could wear them, but after that he'd be able to leave the room and wouldn't look any weirder than the rest of us. Doc, who was on break from Gravis watching, and Amy speculated on what Sergeant Rebus and his scouts were doing to pass the time. Doc's ideas were all about hibernation and other boring medical stuff, and Amy mocked him for his lack of imagination. Her suggestions were definitely more imaginative, bordering on the heretical even, and Doc hastily changed the subject. Unfortunately, he did this by congratulating her on going a whole mission without a facial burn, and on the regrowth of her hair. He managed to duck the bottle she threw at him, though. Nubby and Tink started talking about the various ways we'd come out ahead on the mission. By their reckoning, we were up by a few grav chutes, a power sword, a bolter, and a whole collection of Space Marine toys, not to mention the moderately damaged stealth shuttle that was still waiting for us to get around to fixing the damn thing. Tink was beginning to speculate on whether Gravis really needed the bottom half of his power armor, and what he could make out of it he had the time, when Sarge finally returned from his planning session.
After automatically flipping the lights on, blinding fumbles, and hastily turning them back off, Sarge grabbed a seat and told Tink to stop contemplating tech heresy. All of us watched him as he grabbed a bottle, leaned back, and eyed Tink a little more. In an idle sort of way, Sarge asked us a purely hypothetical question. If Jim had been in the meeting room with him, old Bill and Hannah were busy keeping the ship running, and Tink was here, then who was down in the cells keeping everything running and watching the zoanthrope? Only answer we could think of is Theo, which couldn't possibly be right. It'd be colossally idiotic to leave one of our Xenos prisoners alone and unsupervised in charge of keeping the other Xenos prisoner from escaping and killing us all. Surely there must be some other explanation, one which he was just too dumb to think of, right? Tink pondered that for a second, and then scrambled for the door. Sarge warily laughed and told him to sit back down. Once Tink was seated, Sarge looked at each of us and gave us the lowdown. As we knew, the Psyker holding cells were falling apart, the zoanthrope was doing bad things every time the status field flickered, Sergeant Gravis was at death's door, and our ship's astropath had suffered a severe case of exploding head. We had no choice but to get back into the warp, but we were going to head for the nearest civilized Imperial world first. From there, we could order some replacement parts, get a new astropath, call for the Marines pickup, and hand Gravis over to someone with serious medical facilities. It was going to be rough, and we'd have to stand constant guard against warp shenanigans, but luckily it would only take a week. Just 1 week of frantic jury rigging, dealing with whatever the zoanthrope and the warp could throw at us, and keeping Gravis from melting. Then it would be over. Honestly, looking back, I have no idea why any of us believed it's going to be that easy.
Well, that was a fun one.
It was very tense, because, we had a lot of character deaths at the beginning. And the whole time I was like, please don't kill off any of them. Please make it out of this.
Oh my god, this next one's so short.
It's an interlude.
It's beautiful.
I wager next time we read the interlude, and then we read half of the one following it. To put that into perspective, the length of that, doing that would mean we would read 4,000 less words than we read today.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Jesus
I
Christ,
think that's getting.
Some of these are long.
But it's getting better as it goes along. Although the rate of errors is slowly increasing, as I saw like a repeat of 3 words together. But it's still readable, which is good enough for me.
It's still plenty readable.
Yeah, as long as I can if the errors are infrequent enough and small enough where I could just correct it in my head, then I don't have an issue.
Yes, and it looks like from here on out there will be no more 30,000. Oh no, never mind. There is one more chapter that is greater than 30,000 words, but most of them are around 20,000 to 16,000.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah, the one that's above 30,000 though is bordering on 40,000. So we're gonna want to cut that one up a lot.
That's just more content for you guys. And also, for you guys watching at home, the first episode of All Guardsman Party has hit 200 views. It's our most watched episode. Thank you all for listening to the series, because we all really enjoy it, and we're glad that it's gotten so much traction. More so than Chain of Memories, which is
you should drop some
thing, in my
comments.
opinion.
You should drop some comments.
Yeah.
You should give some suggestions. Find other things that you might want us to read.
Yes, because you can comment on Spotify, and we will see it.
Yes.
You guys should also listen to it 800 more times.
Definitely do that.
All right, we love you.